Ready to roll.
All right, I think we're ready to roll too.
Are we ready to rock?
I think Councilor Crowley, we are also ready to rock.
Let's rock.
Rock and roll. Before I officially call the meeting to order, I will just run through what's on the agenda quickly. This is a special meeting of the Beverly City Council, and so we are meeting largely to take up items that are coming out of subcommittee. Notably, if there's a reappointment, there's a stormwater management letter, and then sort of the big items on our agenda coming out of subcommittee. And one that's also been sort of continued on our agendas pertain to proposed changes to the charter here in Beverly, and then taking up questions about proposed zoning changes. So we will get to those as we go along. And with that, I will officially call to order this special meeting of the Beverly City Council, Monday, February 13th, 2023, 7:00 p.m. Ms. Kent, will you please call the roll?
Owen? Here. Crowley?
Here.
Feldman? Here. Hausman?
Here.
Rand? Here. Rotundo?
Here.
St. Hilaire?
Here.
Sweeney?
Here.
And Flowers.
Here. Thank you, Ms. Kent. Councilor Houseman, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much, Councilor Houseman. So as we're getting into our agenda, I will just offer a word of thanks to BevCam and to Kim in the booth for being here with us. It's important to have that public access afforded, and so thank you for being here. For those who are not able to attend in person, it's a great way to be able to join us and keep track of all of our meetings, streaming live as they're happening. And also, Kim and I were chatting tonight about it's a good way also to have a catalog on BevCam's YouTube. You can go back and take a look at any meetings that you may miss along the way. So thank you to BevCam for making sure to have that access for all. And so I will also just mention, I think sometimes the processes of going through some of these topics can be difficult to follow if you're not with us all the time. And so I'll just mention that on both the topic of the charter and zoning changes, we have had public hearings on those. Tonight is not a portion of the public hearing. This will be a chance now for the council to have discussion and to come to a sense of how we're going to vote. And so I'm thankful to everyone who is here with us in person, thankful to everyone who's watching, but just wanted to clarify that if you don't see the floor open for public comment, it's because this is not the public hearing portion, but we've come now to the council's had a chance to hear and hear from many people, both at our public hearing and all those who have emailed and talked to us. Thank you for that. It's really important, and now we have a chance to discuss. So I will begin by taking a motion to allow us to take the agenda out of order so that we can go to reports from committees first.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries 9-0. So we will go to reports from committees, please, Ms. Kent.
Order number 13, the Committee on Public Services, to whom refer the matter regarding the reappointment for Mr. Sean Leach as a mayor appointment to the Clean Energy Advisory Committee, may have considered said matter and recommend the council approve this reappointment.
Questions or comments on this one? Question comes on the acceptance of the proposal and the adoption of the order. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries 9-0. And thank you to Mr. Leach for being willing to continue his service on the Clean Energy Advisory Committee.
Order number 328, the Committee on Public Services, to whom refer the matter regarding stormwater management, have considered said matter and beg leave to follow. Receive and place on file.
Questions or comments on this one? Question comes on the acceptance of the recommendation to receive and place this on file. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries 9-0. We will receive that and place it on file. And thank you to the Public Services Subcommittee, and thank you, Councilor Bowen, for working on authoring that.
Order number 276, the Committee on Legal Affairs, to whom referred the matter regarding the mayor's response to Order 75A, proposed amendments to the 1995 Beverly Home Rule Charter, have considered said matter and beg leave to follow. Recommend the council approve the request.
Questions or comments? Sorry. I think you might have the same question I do. Councilor Bowen.
Well, no, mine's more of a comment than a question.
Oh, okay.
It might be slightly different, but
Go ahead with your comment, please.
Well, I just wanted to say, as we receive this back and potentially act on it, that I'm really proud of the work that the Charter Review Committee did and that the council has done, and really excited about the core elements of these recommendations. And I think they're gonna really set the city up for success long-term, and I think it's gonna be a really good process to take a couple of these recommendations onto the ballot in November, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we can all have then with the public about what these recommendations entail. And so out of respect for those couple of years of work by the council and the charter committee, I don't want to dig into the details and nitpick these last few pieces that have come back to us, and only want to say I've looked at them closely and think they are second best choices. I think what we passed before was my first best. And so it's disappointing that we didn't have sort of a statement of why we're being asked to take that second best stance. But I think that second best stance is still better than leaving the charter as is. So I'm ready to move forward with that, but just felt like that needed to be said.
Thank you, Councillor Bowen. Are there other questions or comments from councillors? All right. Question comes on, Councillor Houseman.
I was going to make a motion, but I guess we don't need to.
No, but thank you for your, I appreciate your enthusiasm for the process. The question comes on the acceptance of the proposal and adoption of the order. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries 9-0. And as we're going to 276A, I just want to take a moment and also acknowledge that our city solicitor, Stephanie Williams, is here in the room with us, Assistant City Solicitor Jesse Dole, and our consultant from the Collins Center, Marilyn Contreras, who is very helpful to our Charter Commission and also to us as we've worked through the process, is here with us as well. So thank you for that. Thank you, Ms. Kent.
Order number 276A, the Committee on Legal Affairs, to whom referred the matter regarding order number 276, the mayor's edits incorporated into draft charter approved by City Council Order 75A, have considered said matter and beg leave to follow. Recommend they receive and place on file.
Questions or comments? Question comes on the acceptance of the proposal and adoption of the recommendation to receive this and place it on file.
So moved.
Oh, sorry, all those in favor. That's my fault. I'm sorry, Councillor. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. That carries 9-0. I'm sorry, Councillor Husband, I set you up for that by pausing.
Yes, you did. But I was willing to go.
Thank you. Ready? Yes, thank you,
Order
Ms. Kemp.
number 279, the Committee on Legal Affairs, to whom referred the matter regarding the proposed amendment to the Beverly zoning ordinance, various articles related to building heights and inclusionary zoning, have considered said matter and beg leave to report as follows. Submit the accompanying amended ordinance and recommend its adoption with amendments.
Thank you. So this one has several different votes that came out of subcommittee. And so I think the best thing for us to do might be to take those piece by piece for conversation. I do want to pause and just say thank you to Ms. Contreras for being here. I know that charter piece probably went faster than you expected, potentially. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your help and your work with us along the way. Very appreciated. And a big part of the reason why we could just go through that final step as quickly as we did. So thank you. So on to 79. I would like to have us take this the way that we've done some other bigger topics recently that have had sort of multi-step votes. But what I mean by that is I'd like to invite counselors at the outset, if there are counselors with just a general statement or some observations that you'd like to make as sort of a general comment, invite you to do that at the beginning. And then what we'll do is I'd like to go to the individual components of 279 as they came out of legal affairs. And then if there are either motions to move them forward or if someone's prepared to make an amendment, you can make that in the form of a motion as well. So I'll start by just inviting, are there counselors who would like to make any general overarching comment or statement about this topic that we're entering into? Councilor St. Hilaire.
Thank you, Madam President.
Thank
I do
you.
have a few brief comments, and I'll
Please.
try to be brief. First, just want to thank my council colleagues, Mayor Cahill, Planning Director Darlene Wynn, City Solicitor Stephanie Williams, Finance Director Brian Ailes, Police Chief Lorla Scher, Fire Chief O'Connor, as well as members of the Planning Board for engaging in this important discussion. I'd also like to thank everyone who's reached out to me personally. I've met with or spoken with developers, housing advocates, members of the business community, many residents from Ward 6 and beyond, and I just want everyone to know I do value and respect everybody's perspectives on an important topic. Last September, I filed an order to amend the zoning ordinances by reducing the maximum building height to 3 stories. I did so out of concern after back-to-back surprise announcements last June. First, MassDOT abruptly ordered the immediate closure of the Hall-Whitaker Bridge due to safety concerns, and then just days later, news broke that a developer was moving forward with a new 5-story mixed-use project on Cabot Street. MassDOT has since stated that the Kernwood Bridge also needs to be replaced, and it's going to take 13 years to fix both bridges. The resulting impact on traffic since this closure, as Councilor Rotundo I'm sure will know, has been significant and caused Mayor Cahill to put his plans to redevelop the Bass River on hold. Just want to thank the mayor for acknowledging that, moving forward with large-scale development at the Bass River is no longer appropriate. Also, over the last decade, we've seen 4, 5, 6, 7-story buildings being built, mostly on Rantoul Street. The Family Dollar project that was announced last summer, that's the first of that style project to appear on Cabot Street and marks the beginning, of what I see as a transformation of our primary downtown business district, which also includes the Beverly Arts District and a historic and unique asset of our city. And I think it's fair to ask ourselves, is that what we want? I've heard comments that my proposal it's too simplistic, that it's radical, not well thought out. And to those folks, I just want to say, I think you're missing the point. The goal of my proposal is to spark a conversation about the future vision of our downtown and our city. And in that, I think it's been pretty successful. I do recognize there is a housing crisis that exists across Eastern Massachusetts. And I'm proud that Beverly's been a big leader in addressing this issue. As a city councilor myself, I've supported development and housing projects in Beverly, including the new Anchor Point project, which is currently under construction and will add 75 affordable family housing units to Beverly. Beverly has added 1,400 units of housing over the last decade, representing a 7% increase in our total housing stock. Many of us on this council have supported that growth, and it's hard to argue that Rantoul Street has not improved from what it was before. To me, the question before us now is how many additional units are we looking to add in Beverly over the next 10 years? Shouldn't we all be able to answer that? We've heard from the administration that Beverly is short 1,200 affordable units, but the high-priced, high-rise apartments that are being built aren't affordable. Some have argued that we have a moral obligation to build as much housing as is physically possible and that we should eliminate height restrictions altogether. But Beverly cannot alone solve the housing crisis. We are part of a much larger regional effort being made by some, but not all of our neighboring communities. In 2021, Governor Baker signed the MBTA Communities Act, landmark legislation that will require cities and towns served by the T to create zoning district for multifamily housing. This law is viewed as a game changer and will spur housing development in many communities where it hasn't happened yet. Beverly can continue to be a leader in addressing the housing crisis by taking a more balanced approach and by building the housing at the scale and the pace that we can responsibly support. We owe it to the residents we serve to ensure that the cities keep pace with the growth of our community. As a ward councilor, I hear complaints every day about the poor conditions of our roads and sidewalks all the time. Despite this, the City Council authorizing a record level of funding last year, major roads in my community, my district, are in complete disrepair, never mind the residential side streets that have never been repaved in the history that they've existed. We owe it to our residents to develop a real 5-year road and sidewalk maintenance plan that begins to address these needs across the city. I also hear regularly about speeding on our streets and concern about the city's resources dedicated to public safety. Both our police chief and our fire chief shared that since our population has grown, they've seen an increase in call volume downtown, and both sites being below industry staffing benchmarks. What is our plan to ensure our police and fire departments have the proper resources to keep all of our city's residents safe? Our schools were designed to accommodate our existing enrollment at the time they were built, And while space today may not be a critical issue, at what point do we need to increase our overall, does an increase to our overall population impact enrollment and class sizes? At what point do we need to think about adding on to our existing schools or potentially adding a new one? The answers to these questions and others are key to determining how much growth we can responsibly support. We all want to do what's best for Beverly, and I appreciate everyone's passion and commitment to this discussion. I support reducing maximum building heights across the city because I see it as the best way to eliminate new, large-scale, high-priced apartment complexes that are adding hundreds of units of housing at a time. I don't think we have the full understanding yet of the impact that this type of development is having on our city, and I don't think we've properly planned to address the concerns that residents are expressing across the city. We simply can't continue to build and build and build without addressing these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor St. Hilaire. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you. And I will also try to be brief, but I wrote a whole lot of points, so we'll see. But I also want to thank everyone who's been involved so far, and I agree with Councillor St. Hilaire that these are big questions. They're complex system questions, and we need to be addressing the real concerns that we are hearing from residents. And I'm very optimistic about our ability to do that. So one of my main takeaways is that I hope everyone who's been engaged so far remains engaged as this conversation continues, because it certainly will. From what we've been talking about since September, and certainly before, I'm really hearing 3 or 4 really big topics. There are certainly more, but those are the ones I've really been focused on. And I think there are some good solutions that won't make everyone happy, but that carefully balance those 3 or 4 big goals, and many of which are actually captured in our master plan. That was a very comprehensive process focused on balancing competing interests. And I think it's, the process that should guide us. Unfortunately, what's in front of us tonight is not one of the biggest recommendations coming out of that master plan. I think the only piece of what's in front of us tonight that addresses the big issues we've been hearing about is the inclusionary zoning element. So I'm looking forward to supporting that and digging into the details of that, because we have a couple different versions of it in front of us. But I'm not prepared to support the new restrictions on height as they are proposed. And I want to be really clear about why, because it is a complex issue, and it's not as simple as a development versus not development, or affordable housing versus not affordable housing dichotomy. And actually, the height proposals in front of us, I think, are just too limited to work. The master plan's comment on removing the transit-oriented development, tall building overlay district actually doesn't just say remove the district, which is what's in front of us tonight. It says remove the district and rely on dimensional and design standards created with a new downtown mixed-use zoning district along Rantoul Street in proximity to the depot. And we don't have those additional dimensional and design standards in front of us. So I think it's irresponsible of us to vote to remove that option, make a big change to our ability to meet a variety of goals in the city, and not have the replacement in front of us as well. And so I think if we really want to dig into these issues, which I'm hearing the appetite for, there are a few things we should think about. So I wanted to just briefly touch on the 3 or 4 issues I've been hearing, and why I don't think the proposal in front of us solves them tonight, and what I think could solve them, because there are actually a lot of really exciting options in front of us, and I would like for us to get to those sooner than later, because we're hearing how urgent this issue is. So the first area is around the desire I think we all share to protect and preserve the architecture and the social strength of our downtown, where you get that Main Streets feeling, you feel welcome, you have vibrant small businesses, and you feel like you're in a seaside New England town, not just an anonymous block that could be anywhere. I love those things too. I very much want to protect them. That's why I live across the street from here. But I haven't heard how restricting height actually solves that problem. You could have a very ugly, out-of-place building at 40 feet. You could have encroachment that doesn't provide the active use that we're looking for at 40 feet. So it doesn't solve the problem. And in fact, some of the added density we've seen is what's allowed our main streets to thrive. And our small businesses are telling us that, our downtown residents are telling us that. We need to listen to that as well. But there are policies that meet that goal of preservation without sacrificing the density that helps keep the city alive. And that includes things like the more detailed design standards that we have already put a lot of work into and need to get over the finish line. Reforms to our design review board and giving them more tools, that's a recommendation in the master plan that I think could help with some of these issues we're hearing. Policies and incentives for adaptive reuse. Those are things that are at our disposal as tools, and I think we should look to first, because if we put together a package of design standards, it might include some lower heights on Cabot Street, and I'd be willing to support it if it's a comprehensive package that's going to allow the density we need and that's thought through fully. So the next area, and there's only 4, is this question of overcongestion, the parking and traffic complaints, and those are real. I think the state of our roads and the getting backed up and looking for parking, those are real experiences that people are having. We can't ignore that. I also don't see how reducing height alone solves that problem. It actually could make it more difficult to accommodate the cars that we need. We've seen in the Family Dollar proposal that layer of parking garage. If you could have 2 layers of parking garage, you might not have the same issue with parking. So in some ways it's counterintuitive but counterproductive. And also, I understand that the idea of transit-oriented development doesn't translate for everyone, but personally, I've seen it work. When I moved to Beverly, I did not have a car and got along just fine. Now that I have a car, I use it far less than a lot of people living in less dense neighborhoods. That is also a real phenomenon. But if we want to really focus on attacking that issue of the pain point around car use and too many cars in too little space, promoting mixed-use development in walkable neighborhoods all over the city is a way that's already proposed in the design standards that we're almost getting to, and a zoning tool that we can use to take some cars off the road, some car trips off the road. Investing in shared and public transportation options, even within the city or regionally, are ways to make sure that when you do have to go a little further than your walkable neighborhood, you're not adding to the traffic and you're not looking for that parking space. So I think we can work on those things without some of the sacrifices that the proposal in front of us would entail. The next one's around affordability. I think we all share this goal of people who currently live and work in Beverly being able to continue to live and work in Beverly, and to allow new residents to join us here in Beverly. And so, limiting infill density in places where we already have infrastructure is not a great way of promoting affordability. I understand. I'm also feeling the pressure of rising rents myself. So I understand we haven't seen or felt that supply effect just yet. But further reducing supply is definitely not going to solve the problem. And, I also recognize there are people in the city who would like to prevent the population from growing at all and are willing to sacrifice affordability and housing production to get some of the other goals around just less congestion and things like that. I'm not willing to make that sacrifice. I think we are already growing and changing and need to manage that, not just give up. So there are, again, policies that can help us tackle housing production in ways that don't necessarily contribute to these other issues that we're seeing. That's the accessory dwelling unit ordinance that is ready to go and sitting in committee. Again, the design standards can speak to that in building out some of our walkable neighborhood centers. We could revive the discussion about a great estates ordinance for adaptive reuse of large properties that are underutilized, turn those into multifamily housing. We could strengthen the inclusionary zoning, as we're talking about doing tonight. Those are all things that directly address affordability and don't sacrifice on some of the other goals. And the last one is this issue around, we want to ensure that we have the infrastructure to support a growing community. And that, I think, works both ways. So the potential strain on our schools or public safety or water and sewer or roads, certainly that's a real thing. But more residents, more business, a more thriving community also gives us more tools to provide those public services effectively. So I agree, it's a long-term planning challenge. I don't think it's just a zoning challenge, and I don't think that limiting height will address our public services. I think our role in the budget process, our role in the capital improvement plan process, those are where we can make sure that we're providing the services that people in the city are demanding, and that we actually take advantage of the opportunity presented by smart growth and managed growth to improve services for everyone. And I think that that's not an unrealistic goal. It's not an easy thing, but it's not an unrealistic goal. So I think for me, I don't think it's a zero-sum game at all. And so I know we can't make everyone in the room happy or everyone on BevCam happy, but I think we can do a lot better than the proposal that's in front of us now. So I'm excited to support the inclusionary zoning strengthening without the off-site option going forward. But I think what I'd like to see us do instead of passing a height restriction is, take what we've learned through this process, through the conversation that's been started very helpfully, add it to what we already learned and documented in the master plan and the design standards process that's gotten us most of the way to a draft, and get those design standards over the finish line pretty fast. I think that's possible. I think we should pass an accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and I think we should start some of these other next steps so that within a year or two, we're addressing some of these other challenges, whether that's working on the design review board, great estates ordinance, adaptive reuse policies, that we can get those things going. And then just to be very intentional in the budget and capital improvement planning process to make sure that we're actually seeing the benefits of all these opportunities and not only feeling the burdens. And I think that is all I will say.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bowen. Councillor Rotundo, I saw your hand. I do want to acknowledge before you start, just that our planning director, Darlene Nguyen, has just joined us. I know you're coming right from a planning board meeting, so thank you for being here and jumping one thing to the next. And also, His Honor the Mayor, Mike Cahill, is here with us. Thank you, Mayor, for joining us. Councillor Rotundo.
Thank you, Madam President, which is perfect because Ms. Nguyen is who I actually want to address this to. So, Ms. Nguyen, I will give you a moment to come to the podium. Thank you. So a few things that Councilor Bowen just brought up interestingly, and I know there's been conversations I've had personally, and I've said it, that there's four pieces to this whole puzzle, in my opinion. We have the zoning changes on Cabot Rand 2. We have the 3A compliance with the state that we need to make sure we are, if we're already there. We have the design standards, which have been pretty much, I think, done, but not presented, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And then as well as the ADU element, which sort of falls with the zoning. Now, I know we may have gone sort of backwards on this, in my opinion, where we're starting with the zoning right now, and thankfully, Councilor St. Hilaire bringing up this issue, because it has been a concern amongst the Ryle side neighborhoods, especially with the Bass River Overlay District, which has been put on hold due to the bridge. But nevertheless, it's almost as if they're PTSD, because when the zoning downtown comes, they still think about the Bass River Overlay. And I'm like, we're not talking about that, we're talking about this. But there are other elements of this ordinance that does affect, potentially in the future, the Bass River Overlay District, especially inclusionary, as well as the design standards. So my question is, the design standards, do you have a timeline of when those may be presented to the city council to start working on that process?
I'd like to do, yes, and thank you for, I apologize for trying to do 2 meetings in one night, but I appreciate your patience. I would like to do the design standards a little differently than we've done this. Similar for the ADU, I'd like to have a public meeting, at least one first, before I bring it as a formal amendment to council. And that is just because of the level of complexity that's involved in actually putting those design standards in place into an actual legal zoning document. It's much easier to understand in the document that UTIL has prepared for us. And that's not what's going to go, to some extent, we will include that as an attachment to the ordinance, but it's not really, that won't be the ordinance. And so it's I think it'll be a lot more beneficial for everyone to review that document and then kind of map out where, the first step is to map out where the tiers, because the design standards are based on tiers that are aligned with stories of buildings. So my first goal would be to have a public meeting where we map out tiers and what stories belong in which of the districts that we're talking about right now, just the CC and the CN initially. And then look further into the standards and align the standards and kind of dig into those a little bit in the public. And then once we have more of a consensus, I think, on that, then we could turn it into an actual ordinance amendment. I'd like to do that part in the public part of it in the spring, but I think it's most likely that the actual ordinance amendment would come to the council early in the fall, just due to timing.
Just a quick follow-up statement or comment. Thank you, Ms. Wynn, for the explanation. And I just want to kind of restate from the legal affairs that I feel that the recommendations that we adopted were thought out. I think it's a good compromise with the height limits on Cabot and on Rantoul Street. I think, with the start of what Councilor St. Hilaire bringing 35 feet and coming to the conclusion, and I want to refer to Ms. Flannery in regards to the way we look at Cabot and maybe Rantoul, and Rantoul is an avenue, and Cabot is a street which really put a lot of perspective to keep the characteristic intact. We do have a project that was actually already done prior to the Family Dollar, which looks well. You can't notice it, it's not so in our face. But I also just want to reiterate to people that there are projects that are already out there that still could potentially be built. That even though if we as a council vote tonight or whenever to adopt or not adopt the mayor's recommendation or planning board's recommendations, does not negate the fact that, again, these projects still can be built by right because they've already been filed. So I just want to kind of remind us as councils, but as well as anyone who's watching BevCam. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Rotundo, and that is a helpful reminder. It's not something that's always obvious. Solicitor Williams, before I go to Councilor Houseman, I know I saw your hand, please. Oh, sure. Yes, please.
Good evening, and thank you, President Flowers, for allowing me to speak before all the councilors have spoken. I was going to wait to provide this information until after everybody commented, but I thought it might be helpful for people to hear it, and they can think about it as they formulate their thoughts and comments. So under Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 5, which is the statute that regulates zoning amendments, there's a provision that states, no proposed zoning ordinance or bylaw which has been unfavorably acted upon by a city council or town meeting shall be considered by the city council or town meeting within 2 years after the date of such unfavorable action, unless the adoption of such proposed ordinance or bylaw is recommended in the final report of the planning board. So as we know, the planning board did not recommend approval of many of the proposed zoning changes. So I just wanted to flag that because this could become an issue if folks are thinking that, if this doesn't pass, that within 6 months, another ordinance can be proposed that seeks to regulate height, but is tweaked or has more information in it, like design standards. We could run into trouble with that provision. I can give you an example at some point from a case that I have, but I don't want to take up a lot of time right now. I just kind of wanted to put that rule out there, so.
Thank you, Solicitor. Counselor Houseman.
If I may,
You-
I
oh,
have
do you have a
something to say,
question?
but if
Yes,
I-
please.
If I may just follow up with the solicitor.
Solicitor Williams, I think, if you don't mind, okay. Oh, sorry, okay. Okay.
I can hear.
Could you just speak a little bit more to your comments about the potential conflict between votes this evening by the council and the introduction of design standards as regards, the design standards would affect height and form. Some of the votes we have before us this evening reflect height, and the planning department or the public process may result in an outcome where votes taken tonight, or whenever the council votes on certain districts, would also impact on height. There might be height restrictions. So if you could just elaborate that if the council were to vote, or when we vote, on some of the proposals before us, are you saying that the introduction of the design standards would possibly, that the votes we take tonight could possibly preclude some of the design
No,
standards?
that's,
Okay, so if you would elaborate on that,
So-
please.
first of all, I want to be careful about definitively answering the question because it's somewhat of a hypothetical, right? You don't have the design standards before you. I wanted to flag it because right now, as has been pointed out, the height restriction amendments are they're very straightforward, right? It's about height in certain locations being reduced. My understanding is that the design standards are going to be a combination of proposals to reduce height, but also other elements that'll provide a more comprehensive change, perhaps, to the zoning. I would be concerned if the council votes tonight to disapprove the recommendation to reduce the height, with the thinking that in 6 months, you might be willing to reduce the height if it's accompanied by design standards. I'm not definitively saying that this rule would apply, but I think it would come into play at that point.
Counselor Houseman, I know you have
And
other
may I-
comments,
if
but
I can
I was-
elab-
if they
I
have
think it's
questions.
appropriate to follow
Yes.
up.
If I can
Yeah.
elaborate on what the standard in the case law is, I can do that. I'm just flagging it that it's a potential issue. I'm not saying it definitively would be precluded, but I am saying I feel like I would be remiss in not raising it as a possibility, and I can talk about what the standard is in the case law and give you an example of a case in which the court found that it did apply, if that would be helpful.
Counselor Feldman.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing this up because it is a critical, I think, part of the conversation and decision-making process. And I just want to understand that you have indicated that it's if we vote negatively on this proposition.
Right.
If we vote favorably, does that allow for in 6 months, could we then revisit and change whatever we voted on tonight if the design standards encompassed that?
Yes, in my opinion, yes, and I've talked with the planning director about that, and it's my understanding that nothing in this proposal that's before you this evening precludes adding the design standards to what's being proposed this evening. That could be built upon with design standards,
Okay,
if it's voted on favorably,
thank you.
or some variation of it is approved, you know?
So any favorable vote of this type of variation will allow us to move forward with anything in a more timely manner if we decide to take this up.
It's the
more thoroughly.
unfavorable vote on the proposal, and the standard for determining whether it's the same is, let's see, where it is, I had it underlined here. Just bear with me for a second. So the 2-year bar applies to any new action of the same character as a previously defeated proposal. And the proposed 2-year bar is to give some measure of finality to an unfavorable action taken by a municipal legislative body, so that members of the public shall be able to ascertain the legislative status of a proposed change at all times, and to rely on unfavorable action as a complete defeat of the proposal. And I sort of keep saying I can give you an example. I'm going to do it because I think it will help frame the conversation. So there was a case in Barnstable from 2019 where there was a proposed zoning amendment that pertained to a parking overlay district, and it was to authorize as of right operation of commercial parking lots on land within the HPOD that had some legal pre-existing non-conforming status or were licensed as of a certain date as an open-air parking lot involving temporary storage of vehicles. The amendment set out site development standards covering operation of lots within the overlay district. Those standards were addressed, among other things, the number of parking spaces allowed on the lots, dimensional requirements, and demarcation of emergency access aisles and property boundaries. That proposal was, the planning board did not recommend adopting that proposal, and the proposal failed. Not long thereafter, a second proposal was proposed, a second amendment was proposed, and the changes from the first one were, according to the case, as follows. In the definition section, it clarified that commercial surface parking lots shall not include structures fully or partially enclosed that accommodate vehicle parking spaces. Second, in the section governing computation of parking spaces, the second proposal added 2 places in a proviso that the number of commercial parking surface spaces shall not exceed the number determined as of the effective date of the ordinance. And third, it added a requirement that the lot owner shall submit to the building commissioner a plan of the commercial surface parking lot stamped by a registered professional land surveyor, with a little additional detail added to that. And then the court stated that it reiterated the standard that I just provided to you earlier, and the court said, with these cases guiding us, we conclude that the proposed ordinances or bylaws are the same for purposes of GL 40A, Section 5, if they share the same fundamental or essential character with little substantive difference. Applying this standard to the facts, we have little trouble concluding that the second item was the same as the first item. Because we conclude that here as a matter of law, the 2 items are fundamentally and essentially the same. The town council's rejection of the first item precluded it from reconsidering the second item for 2 years. So that's one case. I don't want to derail the conversation, but as I said, I feel like I would be remiss in not flagging it as something to keep in mind, because if there were a vote tonight, and it's totally up to you, if the council votes unfavorably and doesn't pass the amendments to reduce the height, I'm just concerned that if the same type of zoning amendments to reduce height come back packaged with design standards, that could be a problem. So.
Solicitor, I think Councilor St. Hilaire also had a question for you.
My question is actually the same as Councilor Feldman's, but after hearing her response, I have a couple comments, if that's all right. And I would just say, also in response to some of what Councilor Bowen had to say, and I just say, hearing some of, this isn't perfect, right? And there are lots of issues here, and this is really complicated, and, we don't have it all wrapped up in a bow. And I guess what I would say is, I think our time to act is now. I introduced my ordinance changes in September. Here we are, middle of February, and we're still talking about it. And I think we have to vote on what we have in front of us. And, I think we may never have a perfect proposal, and I think that's part of the process. They say in government sometimes, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so for me, I think we have an obligation to act. And as the solicitor mentioned here, that doesn't preclude us from continuing to act in the future, but let's take action while we can. Let's have some sense of urgency on this.
Thank you, Councilor St. Hilaire. Councilor Hustman, I know you sort of yielded some of your time so that we could ask some questions to the
I didn't
solicitor.
yield any of my time. I yield
Put a
my
hold
order.
on your time. I'm wondering if you'd like to come back around to your other comments,
I would indeed, thank you.
please.
Madam President. Yeah, no, I guess I would start also by, I don't want to repeat all the different thank yous that were made, but they are certainly in order. A lot of people have put a lot of time, a lot of thought, a lot of energy. There's a great deal of, strong feelings on a complicated and sometimes fraught subjects. So I won't repeat thank yous, but I certainly want to extend them. So some of what I've prepared for remarks will be a little bit repetitive, but I'm still going to deliver them in whole because that's how they are, how they hang together. And by the way, I want to agree that we have these big issues, but we have votes in front of us, and so we really do need to be able to focus on the particularities of what we have in front of us. So tonight we are focused on two intersecting issues of the proposed zoning amendments presented to us. One is our city's housing goals, particularly lower price points for more different types of housing. And two, our goals for the character of Rantoul Street and in particular Cabot Street. The housing crisis is regional and actually national in scale, but our votes tonight are to respond to them on a very local scale. I think that context and that requires some context and technical nuance for us to make good informed votes. Our local decisions should advance progress on our regional housing crisis, but our decisions tonight will not, on their own, solve the housing crisis, but they will directly affect the quality of life in Beverly. Debate around height and whether it is an appropriate device to address the housing crisis and a low-carbon energy future, I think, is misplaced. It has resulted in some wrong answers, like favoring or opposing height restrictions, to the right question of how to solve a regional housing crisis. The proponents on both sides of the debate, related to height in particular, have poured about 100 pounds of concrete answers into a 2-ounce plastic lunch bag. We have a housing crisis, and it will need to be addressed by increasing the number and diversity of housing supply in our region. And in doing so, we will need to accept, if not actually embrace, change. We may need to make some trade-offs between things we value about the present and what we need for the future. Some things we cherish must relent, perhaps, to the needs of the future. But not everything we value must go in the name of more housing. There are multiple votes to take this evening, or when we vote, on height restrictions. Different areas in the city can and should yield to different answers. Two factors we will vote on tonight will make it harder for developers to make their numbers work. Those two are increasing the affordable housing requirements, which I support, and changing building height limits. Building height limits seem to be the boogeyman everyone is focused on, but that conversation has rather devolved into whether whether height limits are either a silver bullet or a fatal disaster. Interestingly, in the context of housing, the Beverly 2016 Housing Needs Assessment does not set, to Councilor St. Hilaire's rhetorical questions at points, does not set any goal for the number of housing units to be reached at a given date. Instead, it only sets out general goals, 4 of which we will be talking about this evening. Those goals are providing a diversity of housing opportunities across a range of incomes and household types, ensuring housing design reflects Beverly's historical character, maximizing energy-efficient housing measures, and encouraging new housing near public transportation or TOD, transportation-oriented development. Without target dates and numbers to reach, our votes tonight can really, and I think should, focus around those 4 general goals of the housing needs assessment. One of the things the housing needs assessment does not include is responding to the economics of a particular or today's real estate market. And that's sensible because real estate markets respond to economic conditions, and economic conditions change over time. Recessions and boom times should not dictate our zoning goals. Today's interest rates, general inflation, and supply chain issues have raised material and labor costs, having real impacts on today's real estate market. Those factors will fluctuate over time. Just as those conditions were different before the COVID-19 pandemic, in 2, 3, or 4 years from now, those conditions will be different. So when a developer says, as a local developer, like Councilor St. Hilaire, and I'm sure many of you have spoken with lots of different stakeholders in this. So when a developer says that, quote, that will not pencil, the numbers will not work if you vote for this or for that, that statement may be accurate today. But supply chain issues will dissipate. Sellers' expectations for lofty sales prices they may get based upon pre-COVID market conditions can come back down, and I've certainly seen that happen, come back down to earth. And developers and investors are patient. So what does not seem to pencil today may well pencil tomorrow, to use developers' vocabulary. So we should not try to chase economic conditions. We should instead take our votes to set our local conditions to meet our local goals. And if we vote tonight, we will set those conditions for the time being, but only for the time being. As has been alluded, I say only for the time being because the zoning amendments before us tonight do not account for the form-based zoning proposals, known as design standards, that will, as we understand, eventually come before us, presumably this fall. So while the zoning provisions, so generally zoning provisions should have a fairly long-term horizon, as sort of alluded to by the standard that the city solicitor mentioned. What we vote on tonight will be greatly affected and altered, perhaps, and I think likely, when design standards are actually submitted for our consideration. Those design standards will introduce a new way of weighing the factors that the planning board and the zoning board will use in their decisions. So in the absence of those, I consider much of what we vote tonight, particularly height-related restrictions, and this sort of goes to what the solicitor was saying, to be placeholders until design standards are set before us. So I agree with Councilor Bowen and those references to how there are many different ways to go about solving the problems we have before us when it comes to the issues we have before us. But tonight, to agree with Councilor St. Hilaire, what we have are specific proposals, and those are really the ones we need to focus on. And I think, I hope we'll have some nuanced discussions around the ways in which those proposals can be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Houseman. Councilor Bowen.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond, I think, to two things. One, this question of what would happen if we vote against imposing new height restrictions and how that would play into future discussions. And second, what a temporary approach or a kind of quick win approach to zoning really means. Because I want us all to be really honest about the weight of the decisions that we're taking, and that as much as I would like there to be a placeholder, there isn't. If we vote for something, it becomes part of our zoning, and there is a reason that the state law protects property rights in the way that it does by not letting us take multiple bites at the same apple so quickly, and that's that residents, potential future residents, investors, businesses, need to know where we stand on these things. So I would urge my fellow councilors to think about where do you actually stand on these things and not vote for something that doesn't fit within your goals and the city's goals just because it's a temporary fix that will stop some of the phone calls we're getting in the meantime, but not actually fix the underlying issues. And would also reassure everyone that though voting against a height restriction tonight might mean that we can't build that same height restriction into design standards. We can still build great design standards. If you've read through the proposals already, they're excellent, and they could be made even better through a public process this spring and presented next fall in a way that does not go against state law. I think it's really important that we know that restriction and that we understand the constraints we're operating under, but those constraints should not force us into making a poor decision. And I thought a lot about the phrase, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good through this discussion, because I have a tendency to be a perfectionist. So I was constantly reminding myself of that and was really tempted to let the compromise here sway me. But I don't think this proposal is good. I don't think it's going to solve the problems that we have. I think it is going to create some new ones. So if we put in place a temporary height ban, what does that say to someone who's thinking about opening a coffee shop in 4 years? What does that say to someone who's considering jobs in the Boston area and thinking about where to live? Someone who's graduating from college and thinking about moving home to Beverly? It says we don't want them here. Or at least we don't want them here until we can figure out exactly how we want it to look. And I want to vote for something that says we do want you here, and we want to spend the time to figure out how to make that work for everyone. So to me, we can vote against height restrictions that unfortunately are not, as in front of us tonight, crafted in a way that will help, that are crafted in a way that I think unfortunately will hurt, though they're well-intentioned. And I think we don't close off the opportunity to get it right, and get it right soon.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Rand.
Thank you so much. And this has been already a really important discussion that I'm glad we're having here, the full council meeting, though I know that was frustrating for some people at the last committee meeting. I do think this is an appropriate space because we all have different opinions and are coming at this topic from a place of passion, but with these varying thoughts. And I appreciate hearing from all the counselors we've heard from so far. I want to just express that I am also very excited to support design standards, hopefully in the early fall, and will just help in any way I can to move that process along. I do think design standards are overall a much better solution to zoning than even maybe these amendments. But one of the reasons why I think they're the better solution is not because these amendments are too much of a compromise, but because the design standards will address zoning across the city and not just on Cabot and Rantoul Street. So I think that's sort of, that's our passion as a body that's thinking about what I consider the heart of our city. But also a problem when we've all been so very focused on how to limit development in Ward 2, but not how to increase it around the city. And I know that's a scary thought for some of the other ward councilors, but that's what we need to do. And this doesn't address that. So I think, I'm ready for design standards. I'm ready for accessory dwelling units. I think Beverly is ready for that. People who are trying to move to Beverly are ready for that. Elderly people who are trying to stay in their homes are ready for that. Young Montserrat college students, Endicott, Gordon students, they're all ready for something that can welcome them, as Councilor Bowen is talking about, and really open up our affordability, but also create appropriate density across the city, not just Ward 2, not just Ward 3. And that's not going to be easy for the rest of the city to address. I'm sorry for wards, 4, 5, and 6. That's hard. If you need some advice, just, call someone else, because I don't have advice on that. It's hard. It's hard because there's fatigue with development, there's fatigue with infrastructure improvements, But overall, I do think that what we're building is a really beautiful community here, and it's our job to help guide that in the right direction. I'm supportive of these amendments, especially the inclusionary zoning amendments, and patiently awaiting design standards. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Rand. Counselor Houseman.
Yeah, I just want to still clarify something. So just to take the tall building overlay for a moment. If I understand the solicitor correctly, it's not whether we vote in favor of it, of the amendment to get rid of it or not. It's a question of whether or not it stays in place. So it's not a yes or a no vote. It's whether or not there's an actual change that's made. Is that correct? So if we vote to keep it, then we don't run afoul of the standard that you described, if I understand correctly.
In this case, that would be voting unfavorably on the proposal.
Unfavorably.
Unfavorably.
Correct, a negative vote.
Right, a negative vote, so that the overlay district, tall building overlay district would remain in place. Removal of that overlay district could not be considered for 2 years.
Right. So it's really not whether you vote in favor, whether you vote yes or no, it's whether or not a provision stays in place. Am I misunderstanding you?
Solicitor, could I just try to clarify? I think it is an unfavorable vote on any portion that the solicitor is referring to. So it's, I think because an unfavorable vote on item number 1, which is the tall building overlay, is to not remove it. I think it's because we're dealing with a double negative that we're getting a little, but it's.
That's my point, yeah.
Yes, but it sounds like it's any unfavorable vote. So voting no on this first portion and leaving it in place would mean we could not.
I don't.
Right, for 2 years, you couldn't seek to remove it again. You couldn't propose something, you could not propose another ordinance to remove it within the next 2 years.
Right. So if we vote tonight to keep it.
You vote unfavorably on it,
Which is a no vote.
Yes.
which is unfavorable.
Right.
Yeah.
That does not run afoul of a future proposal to change it, correct?
I don't think, I might not be understanding you.
It may be I am misunderstanding. Because it strikes me that the standard really is speaking to whether or not there is predictability in to the general public about what the policy is of the city.
Can I just read the ordinance again, or the statute? Do you want me, I mean, that's what controls.
I understand that's what's
Okay.
controlling, but I'm looking for guidance as a city councilor from the solicitor.
Right.
On how a
Okay,
specific
so
vote would
I think
affect
if-
the outcome when design standards are put
I
forth.
think if you vote unfavorably tonight on the proposal to remove the tall building overlay district, I do not think that within the next 2 years, another proposal can come to the city council and be acted upon to remove the tall building overlay district. I think this rule precludes that.
Okay.
You seem skeptical. I'm happy to answer further questions.
No, I mean, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I agree with the application of the standard the way you, but I hear
Well,
what you're saying.
how would that not apply? Help me understand, because I'm open to having a discussion about it.
Yeah, well, it may be that I'm simply not following it, okay? So, which I'm free to admit if I'm not. So, the motion, excuse me, the proposed amendment is to remove the overlay district.
Right.
Correct?
Yes.
Let's say I vote against that.
Right.
I want to keep it in place, and all the rest of the council does the same thing. So we have now voted no to remove it.
Right.
That means that ordinance stays in place until, I guess, design standards come around, which might seek to also lower the height limit.
2 years.
And you're saying, I gather, that if we were to all vote no and it passes that way, that we would be precluded for 2 years from reconsidering it, even though we've been consistent with the public to keep it in place.
Yeah,
So-
I think that the statute says, no proposed zoning ordinance which has been unfavorably acted upon by a city council shall be considered by the city council within 2 years after the date of the unfavorable action. unless it was, the proposed ordinance was recommended by the planning board in its final report. So in your language, the no vote is unfavorable action on a proposed amendment to remove the tall building overlay district. That's unfavorable action. The result is the ordinance remains the same, but an effort to remove it within the next 2 years, I think triggers this rule. Now, there may be something short of completely removing it. You perhaps could reduce the height to something less than 75 feet, but, so I'm missing I'm not seeing how you think it doesn't apply.
Okay,
And I'm happy to have a
Yeah.
further conversation either here with you or offline.
Okay. Does the recommendation of the planning board, in your opinion on this standard, have any bearing on this outcome, or is it only bear on how the council votes?
So in the context of this rule that I'm talking about, this rule doesn't apply. If the planning board had voted to recommend approval of all the changes, this rule wouldn't apply. So to the extent the planning board has voted to recommend some of the changes, then the rule doesn't apply.
Okay.
Do you have a question? You look
No,
skeptical.
I do kind of wish that this had been brought to our attention earlier in this process, so we'd had a chance to think through it, but, okay.
Councillor Feldman and Councillor St. Hilaire have been trying to get in here, so let's.
Thank you. I just want to speak to some of the things that both Councillor Bowen and Councillor Rand had mentioned, that almost an assurance, at least from this ward councillor, that even if I was to vote to approve the height restriction portion of this, it would be in an effort to further the discussion and continue the work and expectation of those revised design standards. It's not in an effort to check a box and make some of these things go away, because I have been pretty consistent and vocal that there are a lot of development issues and concerns in Ward 5 that are in relation to some of these height things that I completely understand that everyone is focused on downtown because everyone goes downtown and everyone sees downtown. But there is a multitude of zoning and planning issues in Ward 5 that the rest of the city doesn't see, that I'm very eager to address and look for better solutions for the housing to distribute it more evenly throughout the city. And one of those, I'm highly in favor of ADUs, because that is a really great solution for Ward 5 as opposed to what is a really great solution for something in Ward 2. So I just want to get ahead of the discussion and just state my intentions pretty clearly at the beginning of this, that I've taken this all under thoughtful consideration for a long time, and I really don't want to see anything stand in the way of progress in terms of the design review standards and what we would want to consider in the future within the next year, because my expectation is that we are going to be more thoroughly addressing these concerns that we have in front of us far more thoroughly within the next year, not in 2 years. So I don't want to vote on anything that's going to stand in the way of progress more efficiently, is what I'm saying. And I don't plan on letting up on that fight part of it. So that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Councillor Feldman. Councillor St. Hilaire.
So I just wanted to respond to the solicitor and Councilor Houseman's back and forth here, and it just seems to sort of focus me on the idea that this is our, this is our shot. We don't get multiple bites of the apple on pieces of this. And I'm not saying the entire package, and I think, I want to be clear to folks, when I say my goal was to try to spark a discussion, I'm not a planning expert. I don't intend to have all the answers, and I'm under no illusions that limiting height is going to solve any multitude of these issues. We really should be talking about this stuff all the time, and these are tweaks that need to be made on an ongoing basis. So I am very much in support of Councilor Feldman and Councilor Bowen and Councilor Rand. Let's continue to talk about this stuff. Not one thing that we vote on tonight is gonna all of a sudden change everything overnight. As Councilor Rotundo alluded to, there are hundreds of units that are under development and in process of being built around our city right now, and we need to continue to work on this. Let's not lose a chance to do something and make progress on something that we know is an issue in our city, and let's move forward and let's continue to talk. And I just want to be clear to folks that, like, I'm not saying that, you know, my way or the highway and I get all the answers. I mean, that's obviously, you know, that would be very short-sighted, and I want you to know that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor St. Hilaire. Councillor Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam President, and I just want to thank my colleagues for taking the time to provide their input. I do have more specific comments regarding each aspect of the proposal that I'll plan to offer up when we address them, but as we've kind of generally discussed why these topics are before the council and our priorities, I would like to echo the comments Councilor Feldman most recently, Councilor Houseman, and others that have said, really emphasize that this is a dynamic process, and that's how I view it. Certainly this is a decision, these sets of votes will have a long-term impact on the city, and as Councilor Houseman alluded to, there will certainly be an economic impact with regards to any future development that may be different today than it is 10 years from now. But the way I see these sets of votes, not so much as a silver bullet final set of standards for the city. I do believe the design standards will dictate solutions to some of the problems that folks have more frequently cited throughout this process than height will. But what I see these votes on height as doing is establishing that baseline community standard almost of how high we view our buildings in various sectors of our downtown. And from there to then work on specifics of what characteristics the buildings in various corners of downtown and elsewhere in the city we would like to see. So there will be some trade-offs naturally. The reality is it will be more challenging for developers to build if we limit heights as what's proposed now. But I think it's important that we as a council take this time after a pretty long public process and do reflection with members of the public to set those standards and then to work from there. And as other councilors have mentioned, these are the votes in front of us, and I believe that we're certainly in a good position to take what I see as a first step and not a final step in continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sweeney. Councillor Crowley,
Well, thank you.
would you like a chance to get in here?
We're on the mulberry bush here. Let's just finish it up. So I echo my thanks to everybody else and all the hard work that's gone on so far. But what I ask is we don't stop. There's a lot here. There's a lot to discuss. There's a lot that we do as far as where we go for the city. I'm really looking forward to the design standards. I was hoping we'd have that before we had this part of it, but that's okay. As far as where we go, I think as I looked previous years when we went to the 75 feet and looking downtown and where things were happening, at that time it might have been good for the city and where we are, but as we go through and we look at some things, a lot of people are talking about, you know, our seaside community, how do we do it? And yes, we have housing issues to whereas we're looking for more housing. You know, I look specifically just within my family. I have a daughter that's looking for a place to move into, you know, and my mom's here, you know, as far as with us, and I have an aunt, you know, as far as senior housing and those type things go. And there are issues to try to find them here now reasonable. It is somewhat difficult. Number one, you don't have the inventory. The other side of it is you don't have the, you know, how much is it worth? How much does it cost? Even within the last 6 months, you see where everything has gone up quite a bit. So I think as we go forward, we're doing our part in here in Beverly. I think some of our other community partners and cities need to step up and help as far as with some of that housing goes. So that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crowley. Before I think having had a chance to hear sort of general overview from members of the council, I'd like to go to the individual pieces of this. Before we do that, Mr. Mayor, I don't know if there's anything that you want to have an opportunity to say at the outset. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go through these in the order that they came out of legal affairs. And if there is discussion, I would ask that council would make a motion either to support the way it came out of legal affairs. If we get a second for discussion, we can go from there. If someone's prepared to make an amendment, you can do that in the form of a motion. So the first vote as it came out of legal affairs recommend that the city council vote to approve the proposed amendments that would effectuate the elimination of the tall building overlay district by deleting the reference in sections 340D2F, 340D3F, and 340D5F, which allows a building height of up to 75 feet by special permit in a defined area of the CC district. Delete section 340G2 and hold as reserved, and eliminate reference in section 322A2 and section 340I to the associated tall building design guidelines. So this is the vote on removal of the tall building overlay.
So moved.
For discussion, a second.
Okay, thank you. So we have a motion and a second. Questions or comments? Councilor Bowen.
Thank you. I just would reiterate the new information that some counselors are receiving tonight adds a layer of intensity to this conversation, I think. But I really value the open conversation that we've had, and I think we all can see that the ideas coming out even tonight, let alone in the public hearings we've had on this and the planning board's really rich discussions on this, are already better than the proposals in front of us. And I don't want anyone to feel intimidated by the constraints that we're also under. If you feel like this is not the best proposal, and you still want to see development in the current tall overlay development district look different going forward, we can tackle that within 2 years. They are not mutually exclusive proposals. And I know it sounds like we're under new constraints, but those constraints are not going to prevent us from addressing the design of buildings that is bothering people, managing what development looks like using design standards. We do lose a bite at the apple of making the exact same proposal again within 2 years, and that's smart. And the reason that we would lose that option is because both we and the planning board agreed that it wasn't the right proposal to put forward, so we shouldn't put it back forward again. We can put other proposals forward that address the same underlying issues and just don't look the same. So just want to make sure that that's really clear in everybody's minds and that we're not voting out of a sense of panic over new information or new perspectives on the underlying issues.
Thank you, Councilor Bowen. Other questions or comments on this one? Sorry, I keep misreading Councilor Rotundo's finger.
No.
Okay. Councilor Sweeney, did you have your hand up?
You go ahead.
You want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I think, to Councilor Bowen's point, this is certainly a challenging vote because the vote on height, regardless of what the council ultimately decides, won't address some of the stylistic concerns that folks have had with the recent developments within the tall building overlay district. What has been interesting in the discussion about this proposal is that when Ms. Nguyen ultimately presented the administration's positions and highlighted how much of the district was already built up utilizing the special permit or otherwise was at the building height capacity, there weren't many parcels that could likely be developed above and beyond a 55-foot building height, depending on certain circumstances. And so I had heard from folks who said, well, why not leave it? And I think that's a very valid argument. I certainly, as Councilor St. Hilaire mentioned, believe that this area of town has been improved to where it was prior to any of the development that this overlay district ultimately facilitated. However, I view this vote, especially in light of the design standard guidelines to come, as one that does set a standard for what the community would like to see going forward in terms of maximum building height in Beverly, and I believe that a 5-story building height is a reasonable parameter for our city to set. I don't think it would prohibit the development of future housing. In fact, I know that the city is still going through the MBTA community certification process, but it's my understanding that even if the council were to approve the proposal as submitted by the mayor, we very well may still comply with those MBTA community standards in terms of by right density and allowable units that could be further developed in this district up to 5 stories. And so there is a very real trade-off to be made here that we could potentially inhibit future development if the numbers just don't work with a 5-story limit. But I think given what I've heard from folks who have taken the time to speak up through this process and to reach out to me otherwise, it's certainly a fair standard for us to set a 5-story limit in this corridor of Rantoul that would otherwise extend throughout the entirety of Rantoul. And so that is where I see the impact of this vote coming into play.
Thank you, Counselor Sweeney. Counselor Houseman.
Yeah, I guess I perhaps alone among the council still feel somewhat unclear about the guidance from the city solicitor in terms of the ultimate impact of how we vote on this particular issue. I want to make sure we retain the flexibility with the design standards, which are still in draft form, haven't been submitted. They're going to go through a public process. They may end up being changed to some degree. So I haven't really focused on them particularly. I think, I mean, as someone with an urban planning degree who's been very much involved in urban planning as a study, if you will, since my undergraduate days in college, I've seen many different theories or school of thoughts or ways of approaching zoning come and go. And so I guess I reserve judgment on whether the design standards will be a home run for us in terms of how we might shape Beverly in a way that I mean, we're never going to have consensus, but that might be more satisfactory, at least in the process, to more people. So I want to retain the flexibility of what may come from the design standards. I agree with Councilor Bowen that until we see the design standards, I'm reluctant to take tools off the table in terms of what we might do along Rantoul Street. I also agree with Councilor Feldman and Councilor Rand in particular that two things. One is we need to see our neighboring communities step up, but in the meantime, we need to retain the flexibility within Beverly, including on Rantoul Street, to have more housing, but that does not preclude more housing in other wards in the city, and I think that's just a reality. There are lots of other places, lots of other ways to address our zoning challenges, our housing challenges through zoning, other than simply height requirements. So I guess I'm wandering around a little bit, but I want to maintain the flexibility of the design standards. And so I want to make sure that when I vote on this, my vote does not end up precluding design standards that address height, which is just one of the elements of zoning, when that comes before the council. So that's a statement, I guess. Councilor Bowen has suggested that I think I hear you saying that just about the way you feel about the height and don't worry about the outcome. Is that correct, or would you counsel otherwise?
Are you asking Counselor Bowen that?
I am, through you, if I may.
Thank you. Counselor Bowen, if you'd like to respond.
Thank you. I think what I'm saying is that if you want to leave the option open to have tall buildings, if tastefully designed, fitting the environment, meeting the other goals that we have, voting no against this proposal is both the right answer to that, to achieve that goal, and not going to prevent us from having design standards that achieve those goals. To be 100% transparent, though, it may prevent us from writing in those design standards a removal of the tall building overlay district, because that would be sort of word for word what a proposal that we are rejecting, doubly rejecting and not taking forward. However, there are lots of ways to write design standards, and we could, for example, leave the tall building overlay district with a special permit that allows you to build up to 75 feet or 70 feet or something in that vicinity, and imposes really strict design guidelines as to when you could get that special permit granted that would meet the other concerns that we're hearing. It might take some finagling, it might take some hard work by a legal team to figure out exact language that wouldn't look like we're just trying to repeat the same proposal, but that would actually do what I think we're all saying we would like to do, which is have design standards that fit. So yes, if you think that having design standards that might say 55 feet, that might say 60 feet, that might say 70 feet, and that we need to have that conversation is an option that you want to leave open, and you don't want to remove the tall building overlay district for however long it takes to get there. What I'm saying is my view is you can vote no and can still get that outcome.
And so if I make Council President to the city solicitor, would you agree with to the city solicitor, would you agree with the statements that Councilor Bowen just made?
Solicitor Williams.
The effect of a no vote on this.
That was a long statement. So is there something in particular you want me to respond to?
Yeah, what she just said.
Well,
Do you
then
think she said-
I'd like you to repeat it because there was a lot there.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, if I may.
Please.
Thank you. I think the nugget of it is that the state law is in place to prevent local leaders from proposing zoning that the public doesn't support, having it voted down through a public process, and then continuing to propose it over and over until they can get it right. And what I'm saying is, I think this is not a great proposal and should be voted down, and that there are other proposals we can put forward based on the draft design guidelines that already exist that would not run afoul of that. It wouldn't be us attempting to make that same proposal again. We could write it in a way that would achieve the end goals, but of having manageable buildings on Rantoul, but not in the same manner. So that takes a little bit of creativity, it's true, but I think it's a extremely achievable goal, and it would mean that we would have to write those design standards carefully. But if we did write them carefully, I think we could both.
So I think it's true. I think that I think the issue is focusing on the specific things that you're voting on tonight, right? And so if those get cut and pasted into the design standards, I think you could have an issue. And I didn't mean to or want to derail the conversation. I was even thinking about bringing it up at the end, but I'm glad that I didn't. And generally speaking, as long as it's just not a cutting and pasting and then building it out with other stuff, it seems like it would be okay. You know, obviously, there aren't guarantees, but to me, that's a completely defensible position or process to follow. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Solicitor Williams. Councilor St. Hilaire.
So I'm voting in favor of eliminating the tall building overlay district, and I just, I appreciate that this has become a pretty complicated discussion, but I think what's before us is actually a pretty easy decision. What we're voting on is eliminating 6- and 7-story buildings in a narrow area of Rantoul Street that will likely house high-priced apartments in the hundreds of units, right? And what we'll still be able to do is build 5-story high-priced apartment buildings in the same area. And to me, this is a compromise. I think I'd like to see it go lower, but I recognize that might not be where all of us are. And so to me, this is an easy decision. I don't see a scenario where 6- and 7-story high-priced apartment buildings, when we already have hundreds of units already under development, it makes sense for us. So that's where I am.
Thank you, Councilor. Any other discussion on this? We have a motion and a second already. All right, all those in favor of the motion that is on the floor And just so that we're all clear, in favor vote is removing the tall building overlay. All those in favor of the motion on the floor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Thank you, that carries 7-2. All right, thank you. The second vote coming out of Legal Affairs is a longer one, so bear with me. Counselor Rotundo, reading these was your job at the subcommittee, as I recall.
Yes.
I have sympathy for you at this time. Here is the second vote as it came out of Legal Affairs. Recommend that the City Council vote to approve the proposed amendments that would reduce the maximum allowable height of buildings in the Cabot Street area by 1, adding in Section 300-6A designation CC2 and Central Business Cabot. 2, adding a new Section 300-6C, creating a new CC2 sub-district as shown on map 22-056, zoning proposal overview, and 3, updating the official city zoning map accordingly, changing CC to CC/CC2 throughout the ordinance when it refers to both districts together, and amending the maximum building heights in section 300-40D, building and area requirements, to read as follows. 1. Commercial uses, residential uses, or combined commercial residential uses on CC zoned lots with side and/or rear yards abutting a residential zoning district. F, maximum building height in CC district 55 feet when RHD is the abutting residential district. In CC2 sub-district, 45 feet with no more than 4 stories. In both CC and CC2, 35 feet when RMD or R6 is the abutting residential district. 2. Residential uses which do not abut a residential zoning district. Maximum height, F, maximum height, in CC district 55 feet. In CC2 sub-district, 45 feet with no more than 4 stories. 3. Commercial uses which do not abut a residential district. F, maximum height, in CC district 55 feet. In CC2 sub-district 45 feet with no more than 4 stories. 4. Commercial or residential uses within structures existing at the time of the adoption of this chapter. F, maximum height, in CC district 55 feet. In CC2 sub-district 45 feet with no more than 4 stories. 5. Combined commercial residential uses on lots with side and/or rear yards which do not abut a residential zoning district. F, maximum building height, in CC district 55 feet. In CC2 sub-district 45 feet with no more than 4 stories. That is the recommendation as it came out of Legal Affairs. Is there a motion?
Motion. So moved.
Is there a
Second.
second for discussion? Thank you. Counselor Houseman.
So it is my hope that the motion will fail and that a new motion is made which takes the first paragraph of this and breaks it into 4 parts rather than 3, so that the section amending, the last sentence of that first paragraph, which reads, amending the maximum building heights to read as follows, will be considered separately from whether or not the council wishes to adopt a CC2 zone. Because I have a lot of different amendments that relate to how the CC2 zone could be adopted or changed. But it does not make sense for us to spend a lot of time going through all the things that I would propose, different ways I'd propose we could deal with heights, if we're not going to simply adopt a CC2 zone to begin with. So I would ask the council to allow us to vote simply on that first section and deal with the building height discussion separately once we've decided there's a CC2 zone to even discuss. So I would request, given that a motion's already been made and seconded, that we, for a more efficient use of our time and for a broader discussion around the issues of height, defeat this motion only to replace it with essentially the same motion, but dropping off the height piece for a separate consideration.
I understand what you're asking. So my question is, if councilors who made the motion would be interested in withdrawing that motion and creating a motion that is in two parts.
Through you, Madam President.
Yes.
I'm trying to understand is, so for me personally, I'm comfortable with the way the motion reads. So I'm comfortable with it right now. I'm not sure what Councilor Hausman is trying to propose with this particular motion, exception of whether we adopt the CC2 zoning or not. Seems it's going to be more complicated than what's presented currently. That's just my opinion on this whole situation. Maybe a better explanation to it would maybe be a little helpful to me before I reconsider withdrawing my motion.
Councilor St. Hilaire, I see your hand. Did you want to get in there and then?
I just wanted to add that I am proposing an amendment to this motion and, wanted to maybe have the discussion with Councilor Hausman to Councilor Rotundo's point, what are we trying to achieve?
Sure.
And maybe we can have that discussion.
So if I may respond?
Please.
So I believe you understand that I filed 2 separate filings with the City Council proposing 3 different ways in which height could be, height changes or height restrictions could be made within the CC2 zone. So presently, the administration's proposal is for 4 stories, 45 feet. And I have proposed that we consider 3 stories, 35 feet, but in 3 different ways. And I think, without knowing, because we haven't had an opportunity to discuss all this, that there is a fundamental misunderstanding about what a core pedestrian area is and how it would affect what I'm proposing. To discuss that's going to take a long time, and I'm going to make sure the council has that discussion if at all possibly can. And I would rather not waste the council's time to have that discussion about how we could amend the administration's proposal on height within the CC2 if we're not even going to have a CC2. So the first portion of paragraph 2 only talks about essentially the adoption of a CC2 district. It's only that last sentence that talks about what the maximum heights of buildings would be within a CC2 district. And that's really where the heart of my various options or alternatives really lies. Does that help explain what I'm?
Thank you. I do understand, Matt. So what you're asking, Councilor Hausman, is with the motion presented, you want it separated from the rest of them. To accept the CC2, whether we accept the CC2, then you would make your amendment to the CC2.
Yes.
That's what you're asking to do.
Yes.
And to investigate what you're looking to propose?
Yes.
I
believe so.
I can withdraw my motion in order to allow for at least Councilor Hausman to have his amendment presented.
Thank you. And I just, if I may, if this has been confusing to follow, I'm just going to try to summarize, tell me if I'm wrong. What Councilor Hausman is requesting is that we determine as a council if we are in favor of even creating a CC2 district as one vote. And at that time, then we would take as a separate vote the recommendations on height, because that's where the amendments, it sounds like at least 2 councilors have amendments they intend to make. And I think what we're discussing is if the council was not in favor of creating a CC2 district, the amendments on the height would become a moot conversation. So to move us more expeditiously. Councilor Bowen.
Thank you. My only procedural question would be if the council voted to create a CC2 district and then doesn't have a 2/3 majority to define what's in that CC2 district, what does that mean for our zoning ordinance?
I actually had a related question, maybe Solicitor Williams, if I may. I think this is a related question that I had was if any amendment were adopted to any of the height designations tonight on the floor, does that then trigger a process for a new public hearing? Or can it be amended on the floor tonight?
I think Generally speaking, based on the proposed amendments that I've seen, that a new public hearing wouldn't be required. I think it would be required if there was a proposal to expand these proposed amendments to locations other than those specifically identified in the proposed amendments. But the statute specifically contemplates amending and adopting. So I think what I've heard would probably, what I have heard about proposed amendments leads me to conclude that I don't think a new public hearing would be needed. But I have the same question as Counselor Bowen.
I was going to ask you to go to that one next.
I mean,
Okay.
it's a fair question, right? So
Yes.
you create a new CC2 district, and then there's no agreement on what the dimensional requirements are going to be in the CC2 district. So I think that's why it's written, the motion's written the way it is.
So, given that, may I ask you, would your advice be to take it as it was originally written and take amendments to it at this time?
I think you could do what Counselor Houseman is suggesting, but I think you might need to go back and reconsider it if
there's not a two-thirds.
If there's not any kind of vote to 6 votes to decide what is going to be in the CC2 district.
Okay.
Does
Thank
that
you.
make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you for that procedural question. Counselor St. Hilaire and then Counselor Houseman.
I was going to
please.
say, I would go along with Counselor Houseman's suggestion. I'm happy to do that.
If I may. Yeah, just responding to Counselor Bowen, I guess I would repeat back to her the answer she gave to me earlier about, I'm sure there's a way we can figure it out if we get to that point, so.
Well, and I think we just got the way we would have to reconsider until we came to a two-thirds agreement. Given that, Counselor Rotundo.
So then I would like to keep with my motion of accepting the CC2, the original motion presented. And I don't want to rescind my motion now. Being with the information given
Okay.
from the solicitor, the motion to approve the CC2 as stated is where I would like to stay
Okay.
with.
All right, Counselor Rotundo's motion is on the floor. Is there a second?
Excuse me?
Yes,
Point of order?
yes.
So Counselor Rotundo, if I heard him say earlier, withdrew his earlier motion, correct?
I think he just made the original motion again. So I'm asking if there's a second to the original. I don't want to speak for you, Counselor Rotundo.
Oh, you said it correctly.
So you're making a motion
To bring back the original motion, so I received.
as sent from Legal
as
Affairs.
stated, correct.
So Counselor Rotundo has made a motion. Is there a second?
Second?
Okay. Is there any further discussion on the motion as it came out of Legal Affairs, as I read it in its entirety?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm prepared to make an amendment to this motion, although I would give Counselor Houseman an opportunity to respond if he desired.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm disappointed because we're not going to be spending an awful lot of time, but perhaps, hopefully, the council will create a CC2 zone, and we won't be wasting a lot of time that I'm now about to put us through in terms of considering 3 different ways of looking at height restrictions in the CC2 zone. So,
Counselor Sweeney?
Thank you, Madam President. Just quickly, I'll state, and perhaps others will want to state their position on this so we can continue to the discussion about what the ultimate building height is in this new CC2 district. I'm in favor of creating a CC2 district, and I believe that this is ultimately going to be one of the most impactful decisions that we make that is ultimately beneficial to the city, because as Councilor Rotundo mentioned at the beginning of this process, they really are, Cabot Street and Rantoul Street really are 2 very distinct corridors of our downtown, and this, in my mind, is something that we probably should have done a long time ago. And so now giving future councils, future planning boards, the ability to look through the zoning code at Rantoul and Cabot Street as 2 distinct entities, I believe will be beneficial to the future of our city long-term. So I'm certainly in favor of creating a CC2 district.
Thank you, Counselor Sweeney. Other comments? Counselor Rotundo?
Just quick, I just want to state the reason. The CC2, as stated right now, where it abuts one side is 35 feet, the other side is 45 feet. So we're already addressing the heights from my understanding of some of the amendments, is to be even more particular, and to me, I think that's just too much. I think sometimes simple's better. I think the whole, and I speak from my own personal property being affected by this, where it's a 35-foot because it abuts the residential area. The other side would be more towards 45 feet because it's the RHD. I think it makes a lot more sense. And that's why, for me, I think we're overcomplicating some of this, similar to with the whole 70-foot tall building district. I think sometimes simple is better.
Thank you, Counselor Rotundo. Counselor St. Hilaire.
With that note, I'd like to make a motion to amend the proposed amendments by replacing the language in section 340D, building and area requirements, items 1F, 2F, 3F, 4F, and 5F with the following: in CC District, 45 feet, in CC2 Sub-District, 35 feet.
Thank you. Counselor St. Hilaire has made a motion. Is there a second on this amendment, proposed amendment?
For discussion, I'll second.
Thank you.
May I speak?
Yes.
So, with all due respect to my colleagues, in the CC2 district, if the council chooses to adopt that, I proposed three different ways in which the council could potentially think of height limits in the CC2, which really means we would have, in a sense, 4 options on our table right now. One is the proposal by the administration, which is within the CC2 zone, CC2 district, 4 stories, 45 feet. I have proposed 3 different ways of changing that or amending that, which is in my filings with the council, as it was with the filed with the planning board. One of which is to amend that so that everything in the CC2 zone is 35 feet, 3 stories or 35 feet. One of which is to only adopt a 3-story, 35 feet within the core pedestrian area, which I'll explain in a minute. And the fourth is to do that, but also allow for the planning board to use a special permit to, within a 3-story, 35-foot district, allow a special permit for 4 stories, 45 feet, which is what Councilor Rotundo is essentially proposing, but I would allow it only by special permit and propose that it would be allowed by special permit if there was an increase in the affordable housing percentage. That affordable housing percentage would only apply effectively in larger projects. It really wouldn't have a bearing on smaller projects if you take a look at the chart that I filed with the council. So there's essentially those 4 different proposals. The one the council the administration has filed and Councilor Rotundo has moved. What I would like to focus on and what I would like to propose is a conversation around the core pedestrian area and what that is. So I think that based upon the comments I've heard from the planning board and the comments that I've gotten so far, both in, online and perhaps here as well, that the concept of core pedestrian area may not be well understood. As defined in the zoning ordinance, the core pedestrian...
I don't mean to stop you, but we have a motion and a second on Councilor St. Hilaire's slightly different amendment, so I'm wondering if it would make more sense to finish that one, vote on it, and then also you can make your amendments, and which seem like they pertain to the core pedestrian.
If I may, through you to
Yes.
Councilor St. Hilaire. Councilor, you read off a number of sections which would be amended. What would be the conceptual effect of that? Because I'm not sure I know what that is.
Essentially, I would change the maximum building height in the CC district from 55 feet to 45 feet, and in the sub-district to CC2 from 45 feet to 35 feet.
Okay, so that's
more broad than I think you're
35 feet without
intending.
reference to 3 stories, right?
Correct.
Okay, so that's sort of another iteration of what I'm talking about.
Willing to accept friendly amendments to my amendment.
Yeah, so, I don't think the council, can, in an informed way, vote on Councilor St. Hilaire's proposal without understanding options available, because if they were to vote on that, and I were to make an amendment, or I would make it a motion, I think we're just gonna get bogged down in the details. To Councilor Rotundo's point, I think sometimes it's easier to keep it simple. So, I think what I'm about to explain, and what I'd like permission to continue to speak, really addresses what is in effect Councilor St. Hilaire's proposal, but put forth options, because the council should be aware of those options before they vote on his proposal.
Okay, before we get into that, let me just go back to Councilor St. Hilaire for a
Councilor
second.
Houseman, I'd be willing to withdraw my amendments. If you have amendments to offer, do you have amendments to offer?
I do. I've got them all written out and I'm ready to, but it's important. I mean, I can make the motion first and then explain it. I was trying to explain it first and then make the motion, but if you prefer me to do it the other way around, I will do that.
So for the benefit of the council, I think my amendment is more broad than Councilor Houseman's, and I'd be willing to withdraw mine to entertain Councilor Houseman's, which seemed much more nuanced. So I will withdraw my amendment.
Okay, thank you, Councilor St. Hilaire.
Thank you, Councilor. So I guess I would beg the indulgence of the council to hear the concepts before I make the motion, but I will end up with a motion. But I want to explain the motion before I make it. So, the core pedestrian area is defined in our ordinance already. It is a oft-referenced, defined term in our ordinance. There's one in Grand Tool Street, but we're only focused on the one that's on Cabot Street. And the core pedestrian area is defined as lots that front Cabot Street. So in other words, not lots adjacent, not lots that have one lot in between them and Cabot Street, but only the lots that are fronting on Cabot Street itself. And it's only runs from, I'll use the vernacular rather than the technical here, it only runs from Fibber McGee's to Super Sub. Okay, that's the core pedestrian area. The motion I'm going to make is that within the CC2 zone, core pedestrian area, and the core pedestrian area is only those lots that are actually fronting on Cabot Street, between Fibber McGee's and Elliott Street, which is a defined term in our ordinance already, that within that district, that thin sliver, which basically are the buildings that front on Cabot Street, that those would be limited to 3 stories, 35 feet. And to further elaborate, that an adoption of that proposal would not eliminate the building that went up behind Atomic Cafe if it was proposed today, because that was behind, having spent some time here this morning looking at that proposal at the planning department's office, it would not have precluded that. It would also not have precluded the Family Dollar proposal, which is a building behind Family Dollar, but it would preserve the building effectively that is on the first lot that fronts Cabot Street. So at the limits that I'm talking about, it would not have allowed the YMCA project, which I view as sort of a one-off, but I don't think there are many buildings like the YMCA. So I recognize that applying the concept in the way that I'm describing is how best to put it, is an attempt to send a message through zoning about the preservation of that one section of Cabot Street, which is particularly special to us. So within that C2 district that is the core pedestrian area, we have one of two historic districts in the city. It has only on Cabot Street itself, and I'm going to refer to my notes here if you'll bear with me for a moment. It has an historic district which contains a density of historic buildings that are essentially the Faneuil Hall, the Quincy Market, the Freedom Trail of Beverly. It is a National Register Historic District, and when we talk about what makes the CT2 zone, and particular the core pedestrian area between Fibber McGee and Super Sub, particularly special, it is because of the nature of the buildings that are there. The planning board, one of the planning board members made a comment that struck me about how we're trying to solve a subjective problem with an objective standard. And that really struck me because we do have objective standards to measure what is different about that area. It has to do with the historic district that is there. It has to do with why buildings look different along Cabot Street. Now, those buildings look different than the rest of the city because of their architectural style, because of their ornamentation and the materials that they use. They are more complex because of the architectural styles that were prevalent when they were built. And if you just take something, if you'll bear with me, even something like the size of smaller bricks that vary in size, that vary in hue with the surfaces that are noticeably textured and uneven, and with very thin mortar lines, which contrast with a modern brick building, which has bricks manufactured to a uniform size and shape, have shinier finishes, and have uniform wide mortar joints. Those things are subtle, but they are measurable, and they are part of what makes the CC2 core pedestrian area in particular very different. Cabot Street is, in this section, is narrower by design and by history, and because it's narrower, traffic goes slower, and because the traffic goes slower, it is quieter. So Cabot Street has a visual, measurable, definable difference within this section that does not mean we can make decisions based upon subjective, intuitive feelings, but that we can measure by defined standards. And whether this motion that I'm going to make passes or not, whether the planning director agrees with my characterization of how this proposal would be in terms of, whether the building behind Atomic Cafe would be allowed or not, it's important to me tonight, because we have design standards coming presumably in the fall, and because we're trying to consider these things tonight on a vote, that it be very clear to those watching on BevCam, to the planning board, and to the public process as we go through the design standards that come out, that this is a very discernibly different and definably different district, which requires, I think, very different standards applied to it. So whether my motion carries or not, and I'll make it in a moment, and then we'll hear from the planning director, I feel very strongly, because there's been a lot of discussion for a long time, and the notion that we haven't been able to, that height and the districts along Cabot Street are subjective is something I strongly disagree with, because it does make a difference in how we ultimately treat that district in our zoning ordinance and in our design standards. So I will, with that, if you'll bear with me, I will make a motion.
Please.
Thank you for your indulging what I said. As soon as I find which piece of paper I wrote it on. I think I pulled it out.
Is it 279A? Counselor
Yeah,
Houseman?
here it is. Here it is. Well, this is going to be a little bit lengthy because of the way the motion is presently on the floor, as the way Councilor Rotundo motioned it to be all in one. So let me propose an amendment to the motion on the floor, which would add, without rereading the entire thing, when we have the enumerated 1 through 4, I will make a motion that, well, I guess I'll just read it because it's the only way that's going to really be clear. So number 1, instead of as proposed, it would read, commercial uses, residential uses, or combined residential uses on CC zone lots with side or rear lots, side or rear yards abutting a residential zoning district. F, maximum height in CC district 55 feet where RHD is the budding residential district. In CC2 subdistrict 45 feet with no more than 4 stories. In both CC2 and CC2 35 feet, and then here is where I would insert a change. I'm sorry, actually, I ultimately decided not to make a change in that one. It's only going to show up in numbers 2, 3, and 4. So only in 2, 3, and 4 would I'll read those in total. 2, residential uses which do not abut a residential district. F, maximum height, colon, in CC2, in the CC district, 55 feet. In CC2 subdistrict, 45 feet with no more than 4 stories, and add the language, in the Cabot Street core pedestrian area, 35 feet with no more than 3 stories. And that phrase, in the Cabot Street core pedestrian area, 35 feet with no more than 3 stories, would be added to the next 2, number 3 and number 4, so that the proposal that's on the floor, that is both the administration and Councilor Rotundo's, would remain exactly in effect, and most of the CC2 zone would remain 4 stories, 45 feet. It would only affect those lots that are fronting on Cabot Street from Fibber McGee's and Super Sub, or Highland Ave to Elliott Street, to be more technical about it. So that is my proposed amendment to the motion on the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Houseman. Is there a second to this proposed amendment?
Second for discussion.
Thank you, Councilor Rand. Councilor Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam President. And through you, I do have a question for Councilor Houseman. Just to clarify, I know, as you had mentioned, you had submitted proposed amendments in the form of a letter that the Legal Affairs Committee ultimately received and placed on file. In the proposals from your letter, order, I believe it was 279A. Maybe that's the wrong number.
I know you mean.
But regardless, in that proposal, you had mentioned a desire to implement an additional special permit criteria to foster increased affordability. I don't think that I heard that specifically in the amendment that you just proposed, and wanted to give you the chance to clarify the impact of your amendment relative to that original proposal that you had submitted before the council.
Thank you for raising that. So I was going to make that as a separate motion.
Okay.
And that may be a procedural issue. But my intention is to also include that. And I guess I could do that now, if that would help as an additional amendment to my existing amendment. Or I could do it separately.
I was gonna say, I feel like it might be easier for the council to, because it's a
complicated.
detailed amendment,
Yep.
your first one, and so I think it might be easier if we could take them as, and they're both actually detailed, which is not a critique, but just I think it might be easier for us
Yeah.
to take them up.
But I do appreciate
Yes.
the comment, because I think the special permit going up to 4 stories, 45 feet within the core pedestrian area is an appropriate one, and one that I would like to see included as ultimately if the council votes for this, for the concept to begin with.
Thank you. Ms. Nguyen?
May I make a point of clarification on that amendment?
Yes.
Thank you. This is just, Counselor Houseman, did you intend, there's a 5 on the back, did you intend it to apply to 5?
Oh. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's correct.
I just wanted to make sure. May I point out my comment that I wanted to say before?
Yes.
That I disagree that the CPA amendment, the discussion you're having, I think it would, the Atomic parcel and the Dollar Tree parcel both front on Cabot Street. Even the building in the back, it's on a parcel that fronts on Cabot Street. It's not a separate parcel.
Yeah, so I've thought about that. The reason, as I met you this morning and took a look at the Atomic Cafe application, that was an application that was an expansion of a lot which fronts on Cabot Street. And at least my reading, which I could stand to be corrected, I suppose, but my reading is that those expansion rights would still be allowed and in effect under this proposal.
Possibly, but I just wanted to be clear that the parcels itself
Yes.
would still
yes,
apply.
I agree with that.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's a nuance, but.
I agree with that.
And then my other point of clarification is that just making sure that the core pedestrian area is on both sides of the street. It's not just on the
Yes,
side
that's
of
correct.
Frippers.
That's
Okay, I
correct.
just want,
It's on, yes, it's on, yeah, my examples just happen to be on one side, but
Yes.
yes, it's on both sides.
okay.
Thank you, Ms. Nguyen.
Thank you.
Counselors, are there other comments or questions on this? Counselor Sweeney, and then we'll go to Counselor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam President, and I do want to thank you, Counselor Houseman, for the thought that you've put into bringing this amendment before the council, and I certainly want to echo the points that you made about the tangible differences in Cabot Street and other corridors of our downtown, given the historic nature of many of the existing buildings that I would certainly like to preserve. I guess the way that I look at this, similar to the vote that we just took relative to setting the maximum building height throughout Rantoul Street as a consistent 5 stories, when I look at the proposal we have before us now of what to set that first standard of maximum building height to be further elaborated upon throughout the design standard process, I do think there is some benefit to starting with a 4-story, 45-foot consistent standard, which ideally throughout the design standard process, we will further detail specific provisions of, in addition to height, that would preserve the character of the buildings on Cabot Street. My only concern, while I certainly appreciate the sentiment, is that in starting with a more complicated baseline standard prior to reviewing and ultimately approving some form of design standards, is that we may have the unintended effect of potentially pigeonholing ourselves into a scenario where we may want to, if the circumstance arise, allow for some flexibility between that 35 and 45-foot height limit up to that 45-foot ceiling, which I believe is an appropriate ceiling to set for development on Cabot Street. So I would maybe pose that to other counselors. Those are my initial thoughts in hearing your amendment, although I do appreciate and agree with much of the sentiment in what has led you to propose this amendment to the council.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Sweeney. Counselor Bowen.
Thank you. So I also just wanted to thank you for the thought and definition of the historic character of Cabot Street, and I hope that we can go to the BevCam tape when it comes time to draft zoning language and express to developers and property owners what we'd like to see on Cabot, because I think that's really important. I think what's in our historic preservation plan already is really important for us to act on the recommendations there and build on with this work. I didn't hear in your description of what makes this section of Cabot unique anything about the height, and so I feel about this and the next couple that we're going to go through and other amendments related to the specific level of height restriction the same as I expressed at the beginning. So nothing about the details of the height change, that overall perception of the mismatch between how these proposals came before us and the issues that we're trying to address. So plan to vote against these and don't want you to hear that as a disagreement about that historic character or real desire to preserve it.
Thank you, Counselor Bowen. Counselor St. Hilaire and then Counselor Feldman, please.
Thank you, Madam President. So I plan on voting in favor of Counselor Houseman's amendments. I actually would have preferred to see a broader restriction in the CC2 district. So again, I view this as sort of a compromise, and I agree with Counselor Houseman regarding the unique asset that is Cabot Street in that area, the historic district, the Beverly Arts District, Montserrat College. To me, it's important that we keep Beverly unique in a lot of ways, and to me, this is a good step forward. And again, I don't think it's appropriate to have a big, large-scale apartment complex in the middle of Cabot Street, in the middle of our arts district, in the middle of our historic district. And I think that's, to me, what this is about. 4, 5, 6-story building, those end up being big apartment buildings.
Thank you, Counselor St. Hilaire. Counselor Feldman.
Yes, thank you. I also appreciate the amount of work and thoroughness that Councilor Houseman has put into this proposed amendment. In the effort to keep it simple, just like we've been talking about, I do not, cannot support the amendment. I think it's an overreach. I think looking at 35 versus 45, it doesn't really, it's just, I feel like it's an unnecessary complication to an already fairly complicated motion that has a lot of limitations, and I just don't feel, I feel like this is, to Councilor Bowen's point, this is part of the design review process that we can be looking at to look at these buildings, and further limitations put into this with height restrictions and specifics, I feel like is an overcomplication of this motion.
Thank you, Counselor Feldman. Counselor Rotundo.
Madam President, thank you. I just want to point out a couple of buildings existing. We have the Oddfellow building. We have the one off, as you said, the YMCA building, which we all agree looks well. It fits in nicely into the environment. You know, I understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to do. And to speak to what Councilor Sweeney said, pigeonholing projects. But we have existing buildings here. A building we're sitting in right now is fairly, has a good height to it. We've seen some projections of what the heights are. So we have existing buildings that fit in the downtown, the characteristic of it. I know we continually hammer on the design standards, but, you know, when we start really, you know, what we're doing here is we're creating another zoning within the zoning that's already been presented to us. You know, honestly, if I were to choose between two amendments, I would think Council St. Hilaire is a little more simpler. It's, I mean, it's simpler because it's 35 feet, blanket. This one really says is one side's 45, one side's 35, but we're not, you know, it just keeps it still the consistency that, in my opinion, is what we hope to accomplish with this type of zoning. So, again, Council Houseman, I think your amendment, and I've read it, it just, to me, I think it was just a little too complicated. strictly my opinion. Maybe I'm just a simpleton when it comes to that. But I do want to just point out a couple of buildings that are already in existence that we're seeing that are height, and they do fit within the characteristic of the downtown area on Cabot Street. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam President. And to echo the points that both Councilor Rotundo and Councilor Feldman just said, and then to more specifically address the point of Councilor St. Hilaire, what I see this vote doing, if I am ultimately going to vote against Councilor Houseman's amendment and support the original amendment proposed by Councilor Rotundo, that in my mind sets as the first step for envisioning what the future of Cabot Street is and what we want to preserve, set a maximum building height ceiling of 45 feet and 4 stories. To the point that Councilor St. Hilaire made, I agree with you in that I do not want to see carbon copies of many of the buildings that have made up the Tall Building Overlay District appear on Rantoul Street, which is why I'm glad that the council is addressing this proposal. What I see this doing is setting a first step in a process that ultimately will, through the design standards, dictate how the city can preserve the facade of Cabot Street that exists currently with, the more traditional walkable Main Street and the historic storefronts that really are an asset unique to Beverly, to your point. And so that is what I see. First, I see us setting the standard for height on Cabot Street, and then I see the design standards as a way to ensure that we're not just getting smaller but similar versions of the development that we've seen in the Tall Building Overlay District of Rantoul Street on Cabot Street. But what my concern is, as I stated earlier, and just to restate before I'm sure Councilor Houseman wants to chime in, my only concern with the amendment is that we would potentially limit, before fully reviewing design standards, a building like the apartment proposal behind Atomic that does preserve more of the traditional facade of what has come to compose what we all really appreciate about Cabot Street, but still does add housing in a way that I don't think has been, as someone who lives a block away, terribly disruptive. And that really is what I see as the benefit to Beverly coming out of the package of votes here, is that we're not necessarily limiting the creation of future housing in Beverly that we all in some form agree is necessary, but we are first setting the standard here and then going further through the design standard process to really dictate what characteristics of our two main streets and of our neighborhoods that we would like to preserve going forward.
Thank you,
President.
Thank you, Counselor Sweeney. Counselor St. Hilaire.
So I guess I appreciate, again, the desire to act on something that's not before us and that it may be more perfect in the future. What we have in front of us is a proposal for 45 feet. Councilor Houseman is proposing amending that to a smaller 35-foot section. I think, again, the chance to act is now. I'm all for looking at design standards potentially in the fall. If it's later in the fall, some of us might not even be here. And so, I think for us, if we don't want to see big box apartment buildings on Cabot Street like we've seen on Rantoul Street, I would encourage you to adopt Councilor Houseman's amendments.
Thank you, Counselor St. Hilaire. Counselor Bowen.
Thank you. Again, just want to be really clear about what we're talking about. If we limit heights on Cabot Street, we are limiting housing production downtown. We are bringing fewer people downtown to a walkable district, fewer people to support all the coffee shops and the vibrancy, less activity on our historic Main Street, a less active Main Street. Our main streets, businesses and neighbors have asked us not to do that. So if we do that as a council, then we as a council are responsible for that decision. And I'm not comfortable voting for those limits. And I just want to be really clear that you can say I'm supportive of housing, but I want to limit it here, but say that, because that is what we will be doing.
Thank you, Counselor Bowen. Counselor Houseman.
Yeah, just a couple of quick responses. One to Councilor Sweeney. The primary concern I would have to my own amendment is that we have design standards coming, and whether it would in some fashion compromise the ability to fashion a more nuanced, tailored way of addressing what you've expressed, which is similar to what I've expressed about the speciality of the district and the facade on Cabot Street. And if I thought that the design standards would be written to accomplish that end, to protect what is only a 1/2 mile section of one street in one neighborhood in our downtown, I would be willing to not support or withdraw my own motion to make sure that that happens. To Councilor Bowen's point, I very specifically voted to keep the tall building overlay district in place. And I did it in order to send a message clear as loud as I possibly could within the context of tonight's meeting that I am pro-housing, that I am pro-affordable housing, I am pro-market rate housing, and that we can, in our zoning ordinance, chew gum and walk at the same time. We can do that, you've spoken to that yourself, and that to have special treatment for a special 1/2 mile section in one district in our town is not going to have an adverse effect, in my opinion, on how this city goes about creating more housing. I agree it needs to be in other wards. I don't think that we should be saying the Hall-Whitaker Bridge going to take 6 years, whatever it's going to take to be fixed, so we should put that work on hold. I adamantly disagree with that. I think that's what planning is all about. We have an opportunity over the next 6 years before that bridge comes into place to do the hard work, to figure out what might work for our community there. I would say the same thing for, the other train stations we have in town. So I don't think this is, I agree, this is, and I think we all agree, this is a continuing conversation. But I want to be very clear that I strongly disagree that, we have, I did a quick count after looking up the National Register Historic District that is very close to coincident with, co-equal with the boundaries of the CC2. We have 42 buildings in that district that range from when they were built, from 1700. I would say most of them were built between 1750 and 1775. Another a number between 1775 and 1800. Another a group between 800 and 1825. Another group between 1825 and 1850. These are our Quincy markets. These are our Faneuil halls. You could take all the homeless people in mass and cast, not to be, engage in hyperbole, but you could tear down Quincy Market, provide housing for them there. But I don't think anyone would suggest that that's an appropriate way to address the housing issues in Boston. There are certain things that ought to be preserved, and I think that whether it's my my amendment or design standards that come out and provide special protection for the convenience sake, because it's already defined in our ordinance, the core pedestrian area between Fibber McGee's and Elliott Street. And I actually would shorten that on the Elliott Street side, bring it down to the Indo, but that's another conversation. I strongly disagree that protecting that area and our historic legacy will in any fashion, in any way, change the course of expanding the housing that we need here in Beverly. And I apologize if I'm a little hot by using an extreme example, but it really is the case that the nature of what is there will never be replicated in any new buildings. In the planning board discussion, there was a reference to the concern that if we limit buildings, say, to 35 feet, we might end up with poor quality construction if we, for infill projects. There is no way in this day and age that we will ever replicate the quality of those buildings that are 150, 200, 250 years old. You cannot afford to build the ornamentation and the style and the materials that are in those buildings with modern buildings that come. And, part of what, to Councilor Rotunda's question about, well, we already have tall buildings in that section, 100%. We also have a lot of one-story and two-story buildings which comprise these historic buildings. And it is the diversity of the building stock, it is the diversity of the architectural styles within this one-half mile section of our city that really makes Cabot Street special, which is what people subjectively respond to, is those objective, measurable elements of the architecture and style and the age of those buildings. So anyway, Councilor Bone, I apologize for going off a little bit, but I do feel really strongly that we can, as I say, chew gum and walk at the same time in our zoning ordinance and protect that section of Cabot Street in a way that is quite distinct from the rest of the city and still achieve all of our goals for market rate and affordable housing in the city.
So it's my sense that we're probably ready to vote on this amendment. I think we've heard from counselors on this. It seems like people know where they want to go.
If I may, one other thing, if I may just say that I do share on my own amendment the concern that Councilor Sweeney raised about how this might affect design standards. And so I would ask the city planning director, if I may, Council President,
Yes,
a question about that?
yes. Ms. Nguyen, thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening, Ken.
So I have a question about the design standards, which, as I mentioned this morning, I haven't had a chance to delve into. There's been a lot of reference to them. I think some of us may know them reasonably well. Some of us may not have looked at them, like myself, hardly at all. Is it your intention in how they're drafted or how they might be amended to provide a design, a design standard that would specially and specifically treat the area and the buildings that I'm talking about?
No.
No.
They are not written that way. That doesn't mean that they couldn't be amended that way. They're not written for any specific neighborhood in general at the moment, because we haven't set the tiers that apply. I also think that some of what you're speaking of is not best dealt with in zoning. It might be another historic method, depending, you were talking about size of brick, quality of bricks, and maybe you weren't talking about getting to that detail, but that level of detail would not be achieved through a zoning ordinance with design standards. So.
Oh, and don't, I'm sorry to interrupt, but don't misunderstand me. I wasn't talking about trying to replicate that.
Okay.
That would be like Disneyland. No,
Okay.
I'm talking about preserving them.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I mean, whether or not there's nothing in it right now that talks about preserving a certain district or, to my knowledge, I guess I'd have to look through it again too. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't come up with something that's more specific to Cabot Street, or it may need to be separate from the design standards.
Yeah, if I may, because this is an important point in
Yes.
this conversation, I think the subject matter deserves the time.
Yes, although I do think most counselors seemed like they had a position, so yes, but I don't want to have us, we still have quite a few more, so I want to make sure we move forward.
I think those will go fast, actually, but, so,
Have you met us?
you've said that the design standards don't do this. Do you, as a planning director, I don't want to put you in the position of trying to speak for the mayor, but if the public process elicits a desire that is sort of consistent with what Councilor Sweeney and I are talking about, elicits a desire to provide special protection for a particular area in our city, well, not just this particular area in our city, do you think the administration would commit to, and maybe I should be asking the mayor.
I can't speak for the mayor, so.
Would commit to doing that?
I think that's, that's something, I can't answer that question right now. We'd have to explore it.
If I may, because I actually want to get this on the record, and there's a reason why I'm going through this step. If I may ask the mayor to address the council? I'm going to put...
You have a question for me, Councilor?
I do.
It sounds like there is a
very
question for you,
specific
Mr. Mayor,
Yep.
please.
Madam President,
Thank you, Mr.
good
Mayor.
to see you all.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilor,
Thank you. It's really two questions, but it boils down to the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
One is, do you recognize the special nature of this particular very small 1/2 mile section along Cabot Street that I'm talking about as special and distinct? Historic preservation designation does not protect those buildings. I'll witness what happened at Depot 2, where a historic district commission was created simply to get tax credits and then torn down as soon as the developer could do that. So the historic designation does not protect historic districts or historic buildings. Do you have a commitment, to the degree you can speak to it tonight, that to making sure that the design standards that we are going to see in the fall contain some kind of protection that recognizes and provides protection for that particular part of our city?
thank you, Councilor. There's a lot that's special in this community, about this community, including its architecture. We've spent a lot of time with some great experts over the last couple of years, with colleagues of yours in the council, looking at the design standards, and we will have a public process, and we'll see where it leads us.
So you have no position on the question at the moment, I guess?
No, I don't really think it's a fair or appropriate question. You folks are doing your due diligence on these proposed zoning amendments. I'm happy to have all of these conversations going forward. We are committed to the public process around the design standards. I think beyond that, it's really not appropriate for me to try to lock myself into any particular language. I think there's a lot to do here.
Yeah. If I may, to clarify, I'm not asking for any particular language whatsoever. I'm simply saying an intention.
No, I heard your
an intention
question
to
and I answered
recognize
it.
the
I think
concept.
we're good.
Yeah.
Councillor Feldman.
Thanks.
I think we're really far afield here, and I'm actually starting to get frustrated as a counselor who has a lot of issues in my ward that I would love special protection for, and I would love to consider that. So I would really urge us to vote on what we have in front of us at this point.
I would just say I concur and again reiterate, we don't know what's coming before us in the fall, or if it's in the fall, or what it's going to include. So I would just say we need to act on our own on what's in front of us.
So we have a motion, we have a proposed amendment with a second. We've had discussion. All those who are in favor of Councillor Houseman's proposed amendment, aye, please.
Aye.
Thank you. And all those who are opposed to the proposed amendment. So amendment fails 7-2, if I'm counting correctly. Okay.
If I may, Council President?
Councillor Houseman.
In light of that vote, I don't have any further amendments to the motion on the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Houseman. Councillor St. Hilaire, did you intend to present your amendment?
No, my amendments were more sweeping in nature, and given the council's vote on that amendment, I don't think it makes a lot of sense.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Is there any further discussion or any comments on the original motion on the floor as Councillor Rotundo moved it with a second, which is the recommendation as it came out of Legal Affairs on the creation of a CC2 district and the Associated Heights? All those in favor of the motion as it came out of Legal Affairs? Aye.
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 All those opposed? Thank you. That carries 8-1. Thank you very much, everybody. That was good work as we move on to item 3. Here's the third item, recommendation as it came out of Legal Affairs. This is recommend that the City Council vote to approve the proposed amendment to Section 300-37D9, reducing the maximum allowable height of buildings in the residential district, RHD, between Cabot Street and Rantoul Street from 55 feet to 40 feet. That is the totality of that. Is there a motion to approve this as it came out of Legal Affairs?
So moved.
Second?
Any comments or discussion? Counselor Sweeney?
Thank you, Madam President. I did want to make a few comments, given that I know the planning board ultimately recommended a proposal that was slightly different than what came out of Legal Affairs. The planning board proposal was to allow 45 feet up to 4 stories in the RHD district. Ultimately, I was the one who proposed an amendment in Legal Affairs that was voted on favorably to reorient what is before the council now to the administration's original proposal of 40 feet with no more than 3 stories. And so just to elaborate a little on that and why I'm ultimately planning to support this amendment, or this motion as proposed, is the housing stock that currently exists in this neighborhood, and I am a resident of the RHD district, are some of the older homes that are the traditional triple deckers. Some allow for 4 units or more, depending on whether an attic or a basement is finished. But based on my understanding of what I pay for rent, what my neighbors pay in rent, and what rents are charged in some of the newer market rate apartments, this district provides some of the most, if not the most, affordable housing in the city because of the makeup of the current buildings that primarily compose the RHD, those older triple deckers. And so I was very deliberate in proposing what is seemingly a small difference between the planning board's recommendation and the motion that I proposed in Legal Affairs ultimately accepted, because I believe it is more narrowly tailored to ensure that if any of these buildings are ultimately, a developer purchases a lot, tears it down, and seeks to build an entirely new structure, that they more or less replicate that triple decker that could still accommodate, if some form of Councilor Bowen's proposal on the ADU ultimately goes forward, could accommodate, a unit in a garage, a unit in an attic, something that would provide even more affordable housing than currently exists without compromising those structures of the affordable triple deckers that potentially could go up to 40 feet if there's a finished attic or otherwise, that really, I believe, are a staple of the affordable housing stock that we have in Beverly and would be a shame to lose. So just to clarify, that's ultimately why I pursued the proposal that I brought before Legal Affairs and that has yielded the motion before us right now. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Counselor Sweeney. Other comments or questions on this one? Counselor Houseman.
Just to clarify, we're voting on a height of 40 feet or 45 feet?
As it came out of Legal Affairs, the motion on the floor is for 40 feet.
40.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other discussion? Oh,
And just to
Counselor
clarify,
Sandler.
does it include the language no more than 3 stories or not? Not.
I believe not.
Okay, I heard that in Counselor Sweeney's comments.
Counselor Sweeney.
I guess to respond and then perhaps pose this in the form of a question to Ms. Nguyen, that's, my understanding is that regardless of, and maybe this is the technical question, regardless of whether or not we add that language, 40 feet likely wouldn't be a feasible height limit to produce a 4-story building. Ms. Nguyen, if that's your opinion as well, and then this may be a question for the city solicitor. That's my intention. I don't know if that would then limit the 3-story building that technically has a 4th story in the form of a finished attic or a finished basement, that we wouldn't want to wade too deep into the dictating the 3-story limit, but that's a little convoluted. I'm happy to restate any of that if you would like.
The language with no more than 3 stories was not in the original proposal, and I didn't recall that coming out of Legal Affairs either. I don't have, I think generally the properties in this district are going to be all residential, and a residential floor plate could be 9 to 11 feet, I guess, 10 and a half, on at least kind of typical. So it could be a gable to get you up, the 40 feet can get you up to a gable. that may be habitable or not habitable on top of 3 stories, potentially.
So would that be the concern in more narrowly dictating through the language a 3-story limit, is that you'd prohibit that type of structure?
I mean, no. I mean, I didn't propose limiting it, like necessarily having that language in there. We just changed the number in this case, in this one. We didn't have the, and no more than any stories. I think the intent was 3 stories in the original language.
Which personally I'm comfortable with, and I'm willing to vote as the motion is proposed, but I don't know if that addresses what you were getting at.
Thank you, appreciate the
I
clarification.
had the same question, so I appreciate you clarifying that.
Thank you. Thank you, Counselor. Thank you, Ms. Nguyen. Any other discussion or comments on this one? So all those in favor of the motion on the floor, which is to recommend the proposed amendment to section 337D9, reducing the maximum allowable height of buildings in the RHD district between Cabot and Rantoul from 55 to 40 feet. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you. That motion carries 7-2. This brings us to the section that are inclusionary housing amendments. Ms. Nguyen, can may I ask you a process question on these? Thank you.
It's not over here.
I know that you have one where you want to clarify some wording. Did you want to do that sort of as we're looking at the whole, or as we get to that section?
That would just be on 4D. Since I'm here now, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you.
This is just a text change that we kind of threw in this amendment because we were here in this section. And the language you have there, I've clarified, the correct language would be the Southern Essex District Registry of Deeds.
Thank you.
That would be correcting it too.
Thank you. And this is correcting a Scrivener's error.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Nguyen. There are 4 distinct inclusionary housing amendments, so we'll take them one at a time. 4A, here's how it came out of Legal Affairs. Recommend that the City Council vote to not approve the proposed amendments to amend Article 15, Affordable Housing, Inclusionary Housing Ordinance as follows. In sections 300-103A, 300-103A1, 300-103A2, 300-103A3, 300-103C, and 300-104C to change 6 to 4. Is there a motion to accept the recommendation as it came from Legal Affairs?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second. Counselor Sweetney.
Thank you, Madam President. Just one quick point of clarification. Coming out of that Legal Affairs Committee discussion, the original proposal from the administration was to reduce that number from 6 to 4, and just to make sure that I understand what I'm voting on, we would essentially be affirming the recommendation of Legal Affairs not to alter the threshold from 6.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Correct. Yes. This is another one that's vote to not approve, so yes, thank you for that.
Confusing, and I appreciate it.
No, thank you for the clarification. Counselor Rotundo.
I just want to make a comment, it's a reason why it was proposed to not accept as done. It was, at least in my opinion, that this was something that would hurt the small person who's trying to maybe expand on their units, that would make it unaffordable for them to do it if it were to go from 6 to 4, which sort of would in essence be counterproductive to creating some sort of housing or additional housing where it wouldn't be of a larger scale. It's the opinion that, the larger developers are going to do it regardless. It wouldn't affect them as much, but the smaller person would be affected. So that was sort of the thought process behind it. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Rotundo. Is there other discussion or comments on this one? All those in favor of the recommendation from Legal Affairs, and as Counselor Sweeney clarified, this is in favor of not approving the change, so maintaining 6 as opposed to 4. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? That motion carries 9-0. Thank you. 4B, as it came from Legal Affairs, recommend that the City Council vote to approve the proposed amendments in Section 300-104A1 and 300-104C change 80% to 60%, and delete section 300-104A2 and 300-104A3, holding both as reserved. Is there a motion to approve?
So, second.
Thank you. I know many of these, when they're being heard probably on BevCam, when they're just a series of numbers and dashes, are a little confusing. This one, I think, change 80 to 60, we may know, but Ms. Nguyen, could I just ask you just to explain, just for anyone who's listening who hasn't had a chance, a little bit about this one?
Yes, 'cause, yeah, you're right, it doesn't have the 12% in it. So basically, this is, in the letter where it explains in more detail, this is the affordability limits. So right now, we require 12% of units, we give an option for 3 choices. 12% of units at 80% of the area median income, 8% of units at 60% of the area median income, or with using 10%, you can do a combination of the 80% and the 60%. So this change proposes changing the 12% to 12% of units at 60% of area median income, and then deleting the other 2 options. So their only option is 12% at 60% of area median income.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nguyen. Counselors, is there any discussion on this one? Okay. All those in favor of accepting the recommendation as it came from Legal Affairs? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries 9-0 as well. 4C, as recommended from Legal Affairs, is recommend that the City Council vote to approve the proposed amendments to delete Section 300-108A1 and hold as reserved, and in Section 300-114C, delete, in quotations, or off-site. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Similarly, Ms. Nguyen, would you be willing to just say a little bit more about this one for people who are following along with us?
Sure. In the inclusionary ordinance, there are some other options for providing affordable housing in different means, and one of those is to provide your affordable housing units off-site through a special permit, so at a different building and not within the building that the developer is building. And so this, the other options are to pay a fee in lieu for ownership units, and then to use credit units. Or to take credit for units, which is kind of the same thing as this. But so this motion, sorry, it's not the same thing, but you would be able to use this if you used the offsite. So this motion is just to delete the ability to provide affordable housing units off-site.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilors, is there, oh, sorry, Councilor Rotundo.
Just a quick comment coming out of Legal Affairs. One of the things that we as a council, and I'll say it again, is we agreed that, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusionary was a key to us moving forward as a city. It's my opinion that off-site kind of takes that away from it. You know, I know there was a lot of robust conversation amongst the planning board with this particular situation, and how we were fortunate to get a great project on Hardy Street and partner up with Harbor Light, but that necessarily may not always hold true for every project. And so I think sort of we're gonna really be true to what we've stated as a council with this, that this actually would kind of substantiate the fact of keeping the offsite on-site.
Thank you, Councilor Rotundo. Councilor Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam President. I do agree with Councilor Rotundo. I think there's a real economic trade-off here in that we are eliminating a tool that a developer could otherwise utilize to make the numbers work and ultimately providing our city more housing. But I think in line with some of the other votes that we've taken, it's a matter of establishing a community priority. And this, I believe, is a fair priority for our community to establish that there is an integration of affordable units and market rate units within new development. One thing I want to note, just actually coming out of a conversation that I had the other day with Mr. DeFranza, there is another provision about payment in lieu that only applies to home ownership units. So just to be clear, essentially what the council will be doing with this vote is eliminating all other tools available to a developer aside from providing the units at the affordable rate established by ordinance. And I am in favor and will support the motion as proposed, but I do want to make note of this because I think it's important that we, as a council, continue to monitor what the impact of this decision, if it's ultimately approved, is, and if we, at a later date, are not seeing the desired results in tangible increase in affordable housing and may need to add another tool at some point in time to foster that additional affordable housing development. Just wanted to make note of that. It's something that I'm certainly going to keep an eye on, and I am in favor for the reasons that Councilor Rotundo outlined in approving the motion.
Thank you, Counselor Sweeney. Other discussion on this one? Counselor Houseman?
Yeah, I'd just like to say I strongly support what both Councilor Sweeney and Councilor Rotundo is. I think that's the sense of the council as a whole. But yeah, this is a very, although it involves a trade-off, I think this is absolutely the right thing to do.
Thank you, Counselor. So all those in favor of approving the motion on the floor, the recommendation from Legal Affairs? Aye. Thank you. That motion carries 9-0. On 4D, as Ms. Nguyen has already explained for us, hopefully, this is a correction of a Scrivener's error. Here is the recommendation as it came from Legal Affairs. Recommend that the City Council vote to approve the proposed amendments in Section 300-114C1 and C2 and Section 300-114E and replace Essex County Registry of Deeds with Essex County Southern District Essex Registry of Deeds. Is that right?
No, it reads Southern Essex District Registry of Deeds.
Thank you.
So moved.
Second?
Is there any discussion about this one? Namely, please don't make me read that series of words again. Thank you, Ms. Nguyen, for helping out there. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries 9-0. As I was saying it, I was like, surely that can't be. It has too many Essex. Thank you very much. Councilors, that brings us to the end of the reports from subcommittee. Sorry, Ms. Kent. Back over to you, Ms. Kent.
Order 279A, the Committee on Legal Affairs, to whom refer the matter regarding 279 proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance, have considered said matter and beg leave to follow. Receive and place on file.
Questions or comments? Question comes on the acceptance of the proposal and recommendation to receive 279A and place on file. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries 9-0.
Order number 279B, the Committee on Legal Affairs, whom refer the matter regarding proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance, have considered said matter and beg leave to follow. Receive and place on file.
Questions or comments? Question comes on the acceptance of that recommendation to receive 279B and place on file. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries 9-0.
Order number 279C, the Committee on Legal Affairs, whom refer the matter recommendation from the Beverly Planning Board regarding proposed zoning changes pertaining to creation of CC2 district on Cabot Street, height restrictions, and proposed CC2 district, proposed height restrictions in the RHD on streets between Cabot and Rantoul Streets, remove all tall building overlay district on Rantoul Street, and changes to Beverly's inclusionary zoning. Have considered said matter and beg leave to follow. Recommend to send it back to the council for discussion.
Thank you. So this is 279C. This is the report of the recommendations from the planning board, which we just covered part of the conversation that we just had and voted on. So at this point, I would entertain a motion to receive 279C and place it on file.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. That carries 9-0. And as we just received and placed on file those three documents, 279A and B, those pertain to amendments that Councilor Houseman talked some about on the floor tonight. And so I wanted to say thank you again, Councilor Houseman, for your work bringing those to the council. And 279C represents quite a lot of work and conversation by our planning board, some of whom were in attendance tonight, one of whom still is. But thank you also to the planning board. This was a long and substantive conversation at this meeting, and if people did not have the chance to see that one, of course you can watch it on BevCam's YouTube channel, but it was a really rich conversation, and so thank you to our planning board, volunteers appointed to that board and doing some really important work.
Order 237, Committee on Legal Affairs, to whom, actually, this is old business.
I was gonna say, yeah, this brings us back around, so that's the end of reports from committees. Counselor St. Hilaire, we're to order
I was
237.
Just gonna say thank you for the conversation tonight and for holding 237 since last September. I introduced it to really spark a larger conversation. I think we've had that. We've had a really good process. So I'm gonna withdraw order number 237.
Thank you, Counselor St. Hilaire, and I will echo back to you. I think other counselors have said it as we've gone, but just thank you. I know you said at the outset you hoped for conversation to come from this. I think that really was the end result, and so I thank you as well for being willing to keep 237 in the process as we've gone along and have it to be part of this bigger conversation. So thank you for your work, Counselor.
Appreciate it.
Anybody have anything else? Counselor Rand.
Thank you for allowing me to make one more comment. I just wanted to say that you may know this about me, that I actually love a unanimous vote, but tonight I love that those votes were not unanimous. I think that really speaks to the amount of thought and effort that went into all of those orders. In particular, I'm very thankful to Counselor Houseman and Counselor Bowen for the thought that you put into your amendments and shared comments with us. Though they were not brief, I still appreciated them. And I also really appreciate just thinking about how Counselor Feldman bringing up your ward and the amount of unique development that you have in your ward. I know I tend to be very protective of Ward 2, but I'm very lucky that this entire council cares very much about Ward 2 and we're well represented. So I appreciate this conversation, and I know firsthand that my constituents also appreciate this conversation. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Counselor Rand. And while we're on the subject of thank yous, I think I also want to say thank you to our planning director, Darlene Nguyen, who certainly has been working on this in the process with us. And as I mentioned, came from a meeting to be with us tonight. It was very helpful to have you here to help us with some questions. So thank you, Ms. Nguyen, for your work and your department's work as well. Our next regular meeting of the City Council will be next week. It is a Tuesday meeting because of the Monday holiday. So I know that is a little bit unusual, so I wanted to mention it. It will be on the 21st at 7 p.m. here in Council Chambers, or of course on BevCam. Thank you, Kim, for being here with us tonight. Any other announcements or reminders before we adjourn? Thank you to everybody who was with us in person, members of the public who have followed this process. Thanks to everybody who watched us on BevCam. And I know we've all mentioned it, but thank you to members of the public who have engaged with us in countless ways throughout this process, at our public hearing, in conversations, at office hours, emails, phone calls. That's the most important part of local government. And so thank you for your time and your engagement. And I would echo Councillor Bowen's point to please stay engaged. That's what makes municipal government work the best. With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Thank you very much. We are adjourned. Thank you, Kim.